Power, live from Washington, D.C.
From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to a special edition of Balance of Power. I'm Joe Matthew. Tonight, the world watches as Trump and Putin meet for their high-stakes summit.
There's nothing set in stone. I want certain things. I want to see a ceasefire. This is not to do with Europe. Europe's not telling me what to do. But they're going to be involved in the process, obviously, as will Zelenskiy. But I want to see a ceasefire rapidly. I don't know if it's going to be today, but I'm not going to be happy if it's not today.
We'll take you to Alaska, where the leaders are discussing Russia's war in Ukraine, what each head of state expects to take away from today's meeting, the first for Putin on American soil since 2015, as both presidents already push ahead to a second sit-down, potentially with Vladimir Zelenskiy. More ahead when we take you to our Annmarie Hordern, who is in Anchorage, and when we speak to former U.S. Ambassador to Ukraine, John Herbst. Plus, more on the developing news surrounding Intel, with the administration now saying that it's considering using funds from the CHIPS Act to buy a stake in the company. Why the Trump White House is looking to rescue the embattled chip maker and the president's threat now of up to 300% tariffs on semiconductors when we speak with Rebeccah Heinrichs of the Keystone Defense Initiative. And developments from here in Washington on the government's move to send in the National Guard and take over the local police department. The action we're now seeing on the streets as Attorney General Pam Bondi installs her own police commissioner. And the new lawsuit from D.C.'s Attorney General, calling it, quote, the gravest threat to home rule the district has ever faced. But we begin tonight with the historic summit that is now underway in Alaska. Presidents Trump and Putin arriving earlier today, shaking hands before the world for their first in-person meeting since President Trump's first term. The sit-down now focusing, of course, on the war in Ukraine as President Trump calls for an immediate ceasefire agreement. Notably, though, Ukrainian President Zelenskiy is not in attendance, despite President Trump saying land swapping between Ukraine and Russia is a likely prerequisite to a deal. Now, the two leaders are meeting behind closed doors as we speak now, with several key staff members setting up an expected bilateral news conference a short time from now that we will bring you live here on Bloomberg TV and radio. Bloomberg's Annmarie Hordern has traveled to Alaska and joins us live now from the scene of that news conference at Joint Base Elmendorf-Richardson in Anchorage. Annmarie.
Good evening, Joe. What we have here is we are waiting basically for these two leaders to go through hours, what the Kremlin has warned us, maybe 6 or 7 hours of discussions. Right now, as you mentioned, they're with key advisors in a 3-on-3 setting. President Trump will be flanked by Steve Witkoff, the individual who, out of everyone in the Trump administration, has spent the most time with Vladimir Putin. The individual has been going to Moscow and meeting with him, really hours with him, as well as the Secretary of State and National Security Advisor Marco Rubio. President Putin will be with longtime aides. We're talking decades when it comes to Sergei Lavrov, the foreign minister, as well as Yuri Ushakov, an individual who actually served as well in Washington at one point as Russia's ambassador to the United States. And then the meeting is going to get a lot bigger. They're going to expand it out to individuals like Secretary of State, Secretary of Treasury Scott Bessent, as well as Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick. And really, the fact that we have the Treasury Secretary here and President Putin has brought his finance minister here, you can tell that obviously sanctions is going to be a topic that is discussed at this summit. We have fresh reporting that the Treasury is prepared, Joe, to potentially ratchet up sanctions so much to go after Rosneft and Lukoil, two of Russia's biggest major oil producers. And something we should know, it's a little bit more personal. Rosneft is run by a man called Igor Sechin. This is someone who is really seen in Russia as the true deputy to Vladimir Putin. He was his chief of staff when Putin in the 90s was deputy mayor in St. Petersburg. This is one of his closest allies. And when you look at the individuals he surrounds himself with, he is top of the pile when it comes to the oligarchs in Moscow. And potentially the Treasury is saying, if you don't strike a deal here and we don't get to the next phase of potentially the cessation of hostilities or agreeing to a secondary meeting where President Volodymyr Zelenskiy would need to be present, then potentially we could see harsher sanctions. At the same time, Treasury Secretary told me this week they can also show sanctions relief if Putin comes to the negotiating table in good form.
Really interesting and great reporting from Bloomberg's Annmarie Hordern live from Anchorage, Alaska. We'll get back to Annmarie throughout the evening. Presidents Trump and Putin will be on that stage right behind Annmarie where she's standing here. Remarkable optics today, as we just showed you. Vladimir Putin inside the beast, the presidential limousine, alongside Donald Trump as he was seen smiling and laughing through the window, driving across the ramp at an Air Force base, a former Air Force base that was tasked with monitoring the Soviet Union during the Cold War. These are the kind of optics that we're experiencing and witnessing today at this historic summit. Russia's invasion in Ukraine marked the first large-scale war in Europe since World War II. And as the president speaks with Putin on this potential ceasefire Annmarie just mentioned, it is Europe that is not represented in that meeting, despite having, of course, such a huge stake in the outcome. Joining us now for a look at how Europe is watching this summit, Bloomberg's Alberto Nardeli, who is live from London. Alberto, what are European leaders saying following their conversation with Donald Trump, and how concerned are they about outcomes today?
Well, right now they're waiting to see what happens, and it will be an anxious and also optimistic wait. Optimistic because they had a call with Trump this week. There have been lots of conversations between US and European officials. And the message that has come out of those meetings is that they are fundamentally on the same page. Trump has also said publicly that he's not going to negotiate territory directly with Putin. He will press the Russian president for a ceasefire. He will push him to meet with Ukraine's President Zelenskiy. And if Putin does not budge, does not go for a ceasefire, he's prepared to impose more sanctions on Russia. However, there will also be an anxious wait because they've been here before. Trump has said before that he will put more sanctions on Russia, but hasn't. And ultimately, they're not in the room. And they were definitely not in the limousine. So they don't know what Putin and Trump will talk about until Trump calls them.
Fascinating. The president has spent some time lowering expectations this week, Donald Trump, that is, ahead of this session, even referring to it at one point as a feeling out meeting, pointing already to a potential second session that he thought would, in fact, be more productive, possibly involving President Zelenskiy. What are Europe's expectations?
Well, their expectations, they don't really have many expectations in terms of what's going to come out of this meeting. They are very skeptical about President Putin's intentions. They don't believe that Putin is ready for peace. There is more a sense of hoping that President Trump sticks to his word and does not negotiate territories and does not walk on that stage in a couple of hours and say, Putin and I have an agreement. Now it's up to Zelensky to accept that agreement, because that would be their worst nightmare, because they don't really have a position on how to respond if that were the outcome of this meeting. And there's really just hope that Trump sticks to his word in terms of the pushing Putin towards a ceasefire, pushing Putin to meet with Zelensky, and increasing sanctions if Putin doesn't move his position. But like I said before, there's just they can only wait at this point to see what happens.
Yeah. With the view from London, Bloomberg's Alberto Nardeli. Thank you so much, Alberto, for the readout. The big question, and maybe the most obvious one as we await that news conference from Presidents Putin and Trump, is how will President Zelensky react to what, if any, deal may come out of today's bilateral session? Joining us now with his analysis on balance of power is John Herbst, former U.S. ambassador to Ukraine, now senior director of the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center. Mr. Ambassador, it's good to have you back on Bloomberg. President Trump, just a short time ago, speaking with Fox News on the way to Anchorage, suggested that it is not up to him to negotiate peace in Ukraine, rather to set the table for negotiations. Is that all this is about?
Well, I think that is what this is partly about, and I would not use the word all. I think this is very important. Look, it's actually pretty simple. Putin believes that he can succeed in Ukraine, and by succeed, I mean take most of the country, because ultimately Western leaders will not have the will not have the strength to prevent that from happening. And he thinks that's true of Trump, as he felt it was true of Biden and Merkel and other European leaders. Trump has to persuade him otherwise if he wants Putin to deal seriously. That's why people were disappointed, to use a mild word, when Trump did not follow through on his ultimatum to put punishing sanctions on Russia if Russia continued the war past August 8th. I think President Trump realizes that that was not a good look, and I think he's even more serious now when he says if there's not a ceasefire very soon, he is going to take very strong measures to make it hard for Putin to continue the war.
Serious consequences, I think, were the words that he used. And I'm wondering what you see as far as a land swap agreement that might come out of this, or maybe a second session. The idea that Vladimir Putin wants to control the Donbass and Crimea officially with very little to give in return, whether it's Zaporizhia or a smaller plot of land. What concessions will Ukraine make in this deal?
We can't be certain. But Trump has made clear since he won the election that his sense of a peace would involve something like the two sides controlling those territories in Ukraine that they currently occupy. But it's also true that Trump has insisted that it should be a durable peace, and that would require substantial security measures for Ukraine to prevent further Russian aggression. And we've seen no compromise from Russia on that very important point. And Trump has said explicitly in the last few days, he can't determine what land settlement would be made. Ukraine needs to do that for itself, and Russia needs to do that. So these elements have been in the air for many, many, many months. The Ukraine have expressed some willingness to make a compromise. Russia has expressed its zero willingness to make compromise, which is why you need to have serious pressure on the Kremlin if the war continues.
Well, I'll tell you, you've heard a lot of conversation, I'm sure, that this is a win for Vladimir Putin simply by getting the meeting. And to your point that you just made, has Vladimir Putin ever compromised on terms for peace?
He has not had to in the past because the leaders of countries he considers to be adversaries, and he considers us to be adversary number one, never had the stomach to really stick it to him. We will find out if Trump has the stomach. I think that there's a decent chance that we'll find out he does, and that Putin may be surprised he's finally run into a Western leader who will push him very hard to make peace. I'm certainly hoping for that. We can't be sure.
What are the chances President Trump is agreeing to land concessions right now as you and I talk?
I think he would be subject correctly to major criticism after he just said on Air Force One heading to Anchorage, he cannot make land deals. He can facilitate a conversation between Russia and Ukraine. Yeah. And that, I believe, is his objective.
Sounds like your expectations are pretty tame, Ambassador. Correct me if I'm wrong, but what's going to happen when these two leaders walk out on that stage to meet the press?
Look, Putin is hoping he can charm Trump once again. Putin won the game last week when Trump, instead of putting sanctions down, agreed to a summit. And that's partly because Trump believed that Putin might be willing to compromise. There were some, let's just say, inaccurate reports back to Washington regarding the meeting with Putin last week. Once Trump and his team realized that those reports were false, they began to lower the expectations for the summit, which is smart. They also began to talk about the tough measures they would take if Putin does not demonstrate a willingness to compromise. That's good policy. I just hope that those words become reality when it becomes clear that Putin is unwilling to make compromises. Putin may try to change the subject, suggest a negotiation, for example, on new strategic arms limitations, something that's worth considering, but not as a replacement for, not in lieu of Putin ending his barbaric aggression in Ukraine.
He knows Ukraine as well as anyone you'll hear from tonight. John Herbst, the former U.S. ambassador to Ukraine, now senior director of the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center. Mr. Ambassador, thank you for coming back to see us. Coming up, more of our special coverage of the Trump-Putin summit here on Bloomberg. But next, the Trump administration is also considering using funds from the CHIPS Act to take a stake in Intel. We'll bring you the latest details next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
Biggest test of the tariff pass-through dynamics is really going to be August and September data. Maybe it's August, September is that time frame when, okay, maybe you do have to start raising prices.
I think for the president, this represents a fundamental shift and a fundamental difference in how the American economy and American capitalism operates.
I feel there's pressure on the consumer. I think the global economy is slowing, right? Everyone's trying to figure out what to do with tariffs. And, we're all trying to look for these signs of tariffs. I think we're still in the early first inning on tariffs.
Just some of the expert voices from earlier today on Bloomberg surveillance as we keep an eye on the Trump-Putin summit that's underway as we speak right now in Anchorage. We turn to the latest on today's market moves and Bloomberg's Vonnie Quinn, who joins us live from world headquarters in New York. Vonnie, how are markets reacting?
Well, actually, President Trump did a gaggle on Air Force One and made some comments about chip stocks, and that actually caused the market to drift lower. Joe talked about putting tariffs on chip imports in the next 2 to 3 weeks up to the tune of maybe 300%. So you saw the Philadelphia Semiconductor Index, for example, plummet. That dragged on the S&P 500, which ended the session down 0.4%. The Nasdaq 100 down 0.4% as well. The Dow finished higher, interestingly enough, but that was primarily thanks to the component United Health. Warren Buffett and some other major investors taking a stake in the last quarter. We found that out today, and that sent those shares higher. As regards reaction, the dollar index might be our first obvious place where we can look for reaction. We saw a little bit of weight to that today. That could be a little bit of a risk-off tone given the geopolitical risk that's out there. We see currency markets start to trade again. Well, they trade 24 hours, but essentially 5 o'clock on Sunday is when we should be really watching for the euro to trade again. I do want to point out that we got some economic data today as well, which set the tone. Retail sales broadly advanced across all sectors, and that put some, positive sentiment into this market. That said, consumer sentiment was down. Inflation expectations on the part of the consumer rising, and so that sort of put some skepticism back into the market as well. So a lot of cross currents going on today. We also had oil trading, obviously. Now, it was weighty. If you look at crude, either here in New York or across the pond, we did see, that in the mid-60s, low 60s range. That would suggest that we're potentially looking for some more oil to come back on the market. But also there are other factors like the Baker Hughes rig count moving higher as well. So that market is just generally soft at the moment. I do want to talk a little bit about Wall Street expectations for this summit, though. If you take a look at this chart, this is sentiment around the possibility of a ceasefire on polymarket betting. It has been rising to an extent, but you're not looking at the positive sentiment that we saw back in the spring. You're seeing about a 39% chance of some activity on a ceasefire. That's not massive, but it's more than what the president thinks it might happen. He said today that he would not be happy if he doesn't emerge with some kind of ceasefire agreement today. But if you look across the street and the sell side, JP Morgan, for example, saying the odds are very insignificant. I'm going to read you this quote. We continue to view the chances for a peace deal this year as insignificant. Even a full ceasefire appears unlikely this year, as Russia's core demands have not changed and they are incompatible with an independent Ukraine. So JP Morgan's base case may be for a partial ceasefire, maybe an aerial ceasefire, certainly no frontline ceasefire.
Really interesting to get the market's view of all of this. Bloomberg's Vonnie Quinn will be with us for the duration this evening. Vonnie, thank you. We'll be back with you throughout the night as we turn now to an update on a Bloomberg exclusive that you heard first last night right here on Balance of Power. The Trump administration may tap into funding from the CHIPS Act to help finance an equity stake in Intel. People familiar with the talks telling Bloomberg discussions are in the early stages. Other options could be under consideration. This could go in a different direction. But the CHIPS Act passed in 2022 with bipartisan support and was signed into law by President Biden. Here with more on this potential deal, Rebeccah Heinrichs, senior fellow at the Hudson Institute. It's great to have you with us, Rebeccah. Thanks for joining us. I've heard a lot of folks compare this to the Obama administration's investment in General Motors during the financial crisis, the government acting to save a pillar of American capitalism. Is that how we should look at this?
I think it's a little bit different because chips are necessary for American military power. So there's a clear national security imperative to make sure that we have chips made in the United States. And so Intel obviously is very important to that. It's struggled to do what it needs to. Obviously, this plant in Ohio. There are still some concerns about the CEO of Intel expressed by Senator Tom Cotton and the CEO's ties to Chinese companies. So that still needs to be worked out, obviously. But I do think it's different than the Obama analogy.
I got a sense that we had moved beyond that after the president met with Intel's CEO and referred to his amazing story. And I assume that meeting helped to generate this concept. Are we still in the woods when it comes to his relationship with the PRC?
I think that there's still some investigation and that you need to have the senators comfortable with this. If the entire premise of investing some equity into this from the CHIPS Act for saving this company is in order to compete with the Chinese Communist Party and to make sure we're diversifying our supply chains and making sure that they're safe and secure from the PRC. You got to make sure that there isn't some sort of backdoor, collaboration or intel sharing between those invested in the success of the company and potentially with some other conflicting interests as well.
Well, why intel at all, Rebeccah? The Biden administration was criticized for picking winners and maybe picking the wrong winner in this case for the Ohio project. Why not invest in NVIDIA or AMD, or is it simply that Intel needs the money that badly?
Well, I mean, I just think that the administration is in general looking for companies that show promise. This one's been struggling. Obviously, there's some political interest in making sure that Ohio has jobs because it's a critical state from a political perspective. But I think in more, it's just that the promise and the substantial weight that the company could provide in this critical sector. So I think, this is going to be different than the president's sort of broad tariffs against companies and sectors. It's very narrow, it's very specific, and it's meant to guard American sovereignty and security and chips in general.
Are we talking about a move to nationalize the domestic chip industry? This has obviously been something that has brought great concerns about national security, the idea of China cutting us off from Taiwan. Should the government be involved more broadly?
Well, clearly the government has to do something. I mean, we're caught between a bunch of bad choices before us. And so it's so imperative, sort of taking this sort of laissez-faire approach hasn't worked. And these companies have not been able to get their act together to make sure that we are diversifying our supply chain. So if the United States is going to have a preeminent military and outpace the Chinese, we've got to make sure that we're not reliant on Taiwanese semiconductors only. If China can take Taiwan, then that leaves the United States high and dry. And so we're trying to diversify to make sure that we can have our own. And that means that we've got some hard choices before us. And obviously there's some concerns about the government taking a stake in this, but that's why the national security element is so important as the government makes its case.
There was a time when President Trump, I think it was at the State of the Union, Rebeccah, suggested repealing the CHIPS Act, which may not fly on Capitol Hill. It did have bipartisan support. But I wonder, did you support that concept initially, and is it the best use of that money now?
Well, I mean, what I like about the CHIPS Act is this really was a moment in which there was enormous bipartisan support when there isn't a lot of bipartisan support over anything else, understanding that this is such a critical imperative, that you've got Democrats and Republicans working hard. It was a really complex piece of legislation to get passed. And so I'm very hesitant to throw anything like that out whenever you have that kind of opportunity. So it's sort of an unconventional way to take a bill that was passed and look at this money to use it for that. And I think that this is just very dynamic, and the administration is going to have to work with its Democrat and Republican leaders in Congress to make sure that they're all on the same page and that this is going to be supported by congressional intent.
I've only got about a minute left, Rebeccah. If we're so concerned about the national security implications surrounding Intel, do you think it's the right thing to be selling AI chips from the likes of NVIDIA and AMD to China?
No, I don't. I'm not quite sure what the government's thinking there, unless they've got some argument or something more compelling that they haven't brought forward to the public yet. I still remain unconvinced that it's safe to make this deal, that NVIDIA can sort of, it promise for jobs in the United States to try to avoid export controls. I think that from everything that I've understand about this particular chip, that it would supercharge China's ability for AI, and we need to outcompete the Chinese, and so I think it's a mistake.
Really enjoyed the conversation, Rebeccah. Come see us again. Rebeccah Heinrichs, Senior Fellow, the Hudson Institute on Bloomberg. Coming up, we turn back to our top story tonight, the historic summit between Presidents Trump and Putin underway right now in Anchorage. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Joe Matthew. We'll have much more ahead in our coverage of the Trump-Putin summit underway right now in Alaska. But first, some of the other stories we're watching in today's Power Brief. The Texas legislature adjourned today after not having enough lawmakers on hand to convene their special session. Texas Democrats forced the move by remaining out of state in a bid to block Republicans' efforts to redraw congressional maps, an effort that could see up to 5 new House seats under Republican control. Meantime, former President Obama praised Texas Democrats after meeting with them Thursday. According to Politico, Obama pointed to the response by California, which just launched its own redistricting response as a result of the Texas Democrats' protest. A month after Donald Trump met with the EU's Ursula von der Leyen, U.S. trade negotiations and their EU counterparts are outlining their version of a long-awaited trade agreement, according to an EU spokesperson, with the EU's Olaf Gill telling the Wall Street Journal, quote, "Now we ping-pong it forward and back until we get to a final text, and I hope we can get there soon," unquote. And Zoran Mandami's charm offensive has now reached the top of the banking industry after Bloomberg reported on a friendly phone call between the Democratic nominee for New York mayor and J.P. Morgan Chase CEO Jamie Dimon. According to people briefed on the call, the two men discussed Mandami's run for mayor and his proposals for the city in what ended up being a friendly talk. Mamdani has also had meetings with other top business leaders like Steve Cohen, Brad Karp, and others ahead of Election Day in New York City. Now we turn back to our top story, the ongoing summit between President Trump and Vladimir Putin, as the meeting between both world leaders now enters its second hour. We just got a bit of an update from the Deputy Chief of Staff, Dan Scavino, on X, happening now at 5:25 p.m. EST. This is posted about 5 minutes ago. President Trump, Secretary Rubio, and Steve Witkoff are still meeting behind closed doors with President Putin and the Russian delegation here at Joint Base Elmendorf-Richardson in Anchorage, Alaska. If you're with us on Bloomberg TV or YouTube, you see a live view of the press briefing room where reporters are standing by to ask questions of these two men when they emerge. We've got the two podiums set up in a backdrop that reads "Pursuing Peace," not to be confused with "Reaching Peace." And when they do emerge, we will bring this news conference to you here live on Bloomberg TV and radio. For more analysis, we're now joined by a voice of experience in Ivo Daalder, the former U.S. ambassador to NATO in the Obama administration and now senior fellow at Harvard's Belfer Center. Mr. Ambassador, welcome to Bloomberg TV and radio. How come there are no Europeans at the table?
Yeah, that's a good question. Why aren't the Ukrainians at the table either? This is, after all, a war that Russia started against Ukraine. It's not going to end unless Russia and Ukraine start talking to each other. The Europeans, which will have to be part of a security agreement to ensure that Ukraine is backed up and that any agreement that is held, that the Russians are held to it, are all part of this conversation. And so it is a rather strange tableau to see the president of the United States, which is not a part of to the conflict, meeting with the president of Russia, who is the instigator of this conflict, but not the victim of the conflict, Ukraine, being at the table.
You know, President Trump told European leaders and President Zelenskiy in a meeting earlier this week, a call that took place, that it was his goal to achieve a ceasefire agreement at this meeting. He since told reporters at the White House this was simply a feeling out session. He told Fox News earlier today that he was there to simply set the table for peace negotiations. Ambassador, which one do you think it is?
You know, we will have to wait and see. I think it's probably all three. At the very least, the feeling out has happened. The president said he would know in a minute or two or three or four whether the President Putin was serious. Presumably, he now thinks he is, because they're well into the second hour of direct talks. He has also promised not to negotiate territorial swaps or any territorial changes, and reiterated that on the way to Alaska this morning. And so the proposal on the table is the proposal that the U.S. has put on the table, which is an unconditional ceasefire. Ukraine has said, we will accept an unconditional ceasefire for 30 days, for 60 days, and the obstacle is President Putin. So if we're going to get a ceasefire, that would be great. We could then move to serious negotiations between the actual parties themselves. The United States can facilitate and mediate in those negotiations. But it will have the U.S. on the table. The Europeans will need to be there, but it has to be negotiations between Ukraine and Russia. Better to do that if there is a ceasefire. But one way or another, this meeting can only be a step one on a long, long process to get us to an end.
Okay, so it sounds like you agree with President Trump that a second meeting, assuming one is achieved here, could be, in fact, more productive than what takes place today.
Yeah, absolutely. I would have preferred the second meeting to be the first meeting. After all, it was apparently President Trump's proposal to have a meeting not only with President Putin, but with President Zelenskiy. President Putin said no. My answer to that would have been, well, sorry, Vladimir, call me when you're ready to have a meeting, because I'm not having a meeting one-on-one with you. That's not going to end this war. You need to have a meeting with President Zelenskiy. I'm happy to facilitate that, but until you're ready to do that, there's no meeting. Unfortunately, that didn't happen. The President Trump decided that he needed to invite President Putin, an indicted war criminal, for a person accused of stealing 20,000 kids from Ukraine to Russia, inviting him to U.S. soil and in fact, literally give him a red carpet treatment and do something extraordinary. Yeah. To sit in the beast with him. Most people don't get to see the beast from the outside, let alone from the inside.
Well, I'm curious. I'm glad you mentioned this. Being the ambassador to NATO means you have a keen sense of protocol. What did you make of Donald Trump clapping, his applauding, as Vladimir Putin made his way up to him on that red carpet you described? We're showing their joint arrival here on Bloomberg TV right now. It almost looked like the beginning, opening ceremonies of the Olympics with Alaska 2025 in the big letters. Then they jump in the beast together, Ambassador. Is this all riffing? Is Donald Trump making this up as he goes? Or would that have required an agreement or some pre-planning?
No, I think my sense is here that this is something that happened on a spur in a moment. Now, Donald Trump may have had this in mind, but the Russians, by all accounts, had a car ready for President Putin to take him to the place where the actual meeting was going to take place. The conversation that they were having suggested, Trump saying, well, why don't you drive with me? That's okay when you're buds. But the idea that the President of the United States would bring into his own car President Putin, who couldn't believe in many ways, I think we're seeing pictures of this right now, couldn't believe his luck. Laughing out there, grinning, say, look at me, I made it into the big leagues. And indeed, that's what President Putin had. The moment that he stepped down on U.S. soil to meet the President of the United States, he had already achieved what he wanted to achieve. He wanted to be treated like a normal leader, like a normal country, in fact, like a great power. He's not. He's a war criminal. He's a man who started a war that has now killed, left wounded or killed over 1 million casualties, both Russian and Ukrainian. And to treat him as if this is somehow an Olympic opening or something like that, or a normal diplomatic event is uncalled for, frankly.
Ambassador, I'd love for you to bring us in the room, and I realize that this may not be a typical meeting, but what would one look like? I suspect there would be an agenda, and probably a lot more people than are in this one. It looks like 3 and 3 here. He decided to bring Marco Rubio and Steve Witkoff with him, and their Russian counterparts are in the room as well. Are they following an agenda on a piece of paper? Is this being recorded? What's happening in that room that we cannot see?
There's unlikely to be an agenda. There probably has been a back and forth about the issues that they want to discuss. Clearly, Ukraine will be one of the issues. The president will be pressing for a ceasefire. I assume that Putin, who is a true veteran, and in fact one of the most knowledgeable leaders on the world stage, has been in power for well over a quarter century, will have his own script. What Putin tends to do is to talk for long periods of time, sort of exhaustingly, to remind his interlocutors what this is all about and the grievances that Russia has had. I assume part of that is one of the reasons it's going longer. We also will have, presumably, hopefully, simultaneous translation, which will make the meeting go a little longer. But Putin will have tried to do the following. He would have said, I know you want to find a way to end this war. So do I. I'm willing to move a little bit beyond where I've been today, perhaps something like a ceasefire of long-range strikes or anything else. But then he would say, but Mr. President, I think we should talk about the real issues. And the real issues is to normalize our relationship, to build an economic relationship that is mutually beneficial for us. Maybe we should talk about nuclear arms control, an issue that I know, Mr. President, you care about, I care about. Only our two countries have these weapons in large numbers, and we should have an agreement about that, and sort of divert away from the agenda that the president has, which is we need to end this war in Ukraine, and you need to make the first steps. And this is going to be a back and forth, pretty unstructured, I would imagine, in which Mr. Witkoff and Secretary Rubio will be writing notes to the president to try, and the same will be happening for Mr. Ushakov and Secretary Foreign Minister Lavrov, who are also in the room. But this is really going to be a meeting of those two guys across the table, trying to figure out how they can move the relationship forward in a way that satisfies the goals of both sides.
Ambassador, we really appreciate your insights this evening. Ivo Daalder, former U.S. ambassador to NATO, now senior fellow at Harvard's Belfer Center. We thank you, as always. Come back and see us on Bloomberg. Coming up in our special coverage, Washington, D.C. sued the Trump administration today over its takeover of the city's police force. We're going to talk about what this means for the nation's capital next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. It's Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Joe Matthew in Washington. Back with us now, Bloomberg's Annmarie Hordern, who is reporting live from Anchorage, Alaska, where President Trump is currently behind closed doors with Vladimir Putin, along with, they each have a couple of their lieutenants with them in the room, but a very small circle at the table as we now move into hour 2 of this summit. Annmarie, what can you tell us?
Yeah, they're still in this meeting when President Trump is still sitting alongside Steve Witkoff and Marco Rubio, his Secretary of State and also National Security Advisor, and then flanked, of course, with President Putin, their longtime aides for decades. We have Sergei Lavrov, his foreign minister, and then Yuri Ushakov, who, of course, was a former U.S. ambassador to Russia, longtime Kremlin foreign policy aide. And they are still in the middle of this meeting. So one thing is for sure, when President Trump this week said if he would know within minutes if the meeting was going south, he'd walk away, he's still there. After this, then, they're going to extend the bilateral meetings. They're going to bring in, of course, Secretary of Treasury Scott Bessent, as well as Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick. And then the Finance Minister of Russia is also in attendance alongside the Defense Minister. So just based on the personnel, you obviously know that defense, maybe territorial swaps will be discussed. But President Trump said even if they're talked about, no decision will be made without Ukraine. And then, of course, sanctions will be key here, having both their finance chiefs in the room. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent joined us this week on surveillance, and he said to me that they have a menu of options at the Treasury. They can either ratchet sanctions up, going after secondary sanctions like they are doing with Russian crude going to India. Obviously, it would be going to China, Russia's biggest purchaser. Or they can have sanctions relief if Putin comes to the table in a good faith manner. We also have reporting at Bloomberg that Treasury is considering going after the two biggest oil majors. Joe, I can't explain how important this is because Rosneft and Lukoil are brand names in Russia, and one of them is run by Igor Sechin. In Russian circles, this is the true deputy for Vladimir Putin. He was his chief of staff when Putin was deputy mayor in St. Petersburg. He's been with him since the 90s. So this would be going after someone incredibly close to Vladimir Putin, but also really the lifeblood of the Russian economy, because Putin is only able to fund this war by his completely exporting Russian oil and gas.
All right, Annmarie, thank you so much. Bloomberg's Annmarie Hordern in the very room that Trump and Putin will appear in. We'll check back with you throughout the evening as we turn to another story we're watching unfold here in the nation's capital. That's the Trump administration's effort to take over the city's police force. Joining us now with the latest on this story, Bloomberg's Myles Miller, who joins live from New York. Myles, the pushback now coming from D.C.
Yeah, that's right. After a federal court hearing, D.C. leaders say Police Chief Pamela Smith will remain in charge of the D.C. police force, despite an attempt by the Trump administration to install a federal emergency commissioner. Now, the dispute began late yesterday when Attorney General Pam Bondi declared that the new head of the police department would be DEA Administrator Terrence Cole. She said that Smith would be removed from command and would be rescinding policies that limit cooperation with immigration enforcement. She also said that D.C. was no longer a sanctuary city. Well, the city took the government to court. There's no decision yet, but D.C. is saying that Pamela Smith will remain the head of the police force. Muriel Bowser said it's plainly against the home rule charter and says the city wants the federal officers deployed strategically. Now, the Attorney General for D.C., Brian Schwab, called the move a hostile takeover and said that the judge today recognized that this is flagrantly illegal. The negotiations over Bondi's order will continue into next week, and we are expecting to hear more from the judge in that time. We may hear from the judge before then, but for right now, leaders in D.C. are saying that Pamela Smith will remain the head of D.C.'s police department and will be helping to deploy these federal officers, although she has no control over those federal officers.
Bloomberg's Myles Miller, thank you so much for the update on this, Myles. We'll be watching this, of course, over the next couple of days. Joining us now, this evening's political panel, Bloomberg Politics contributors Rick Davis, partner at Stone Court Capital, our Republican strategist, alongside Democratic analyst Jeannie Shanzano, political science professor at Iona University. Great to have both of you with us here. And I should say that Rick and Jeannie will be with us for the duration, what could be a pretty late evening here as we wait for both of these presidents to emerge. I want to ask you both about what's happening here in the nation's capital, though, and the pushback that we are seeing from Washington, D.C. Jeannie, this goes to court. How will it end?
You know, I don't know that we're clear. We knew this was going to go to court. I have to give the mayor and the police commissioner and everybody in the D.C. government credit. They have been remarkably circumspect about what they have fought back on and what they haven't. For them, they said this was a bridge too far, as Myles just explained so beautifully. So they went to court. But I think what is very concerning to me is what seems to be a habit of the Trump administration of giving somebody like Cole, just became head of the DEA, a job that he is not trained for, on top of a big job he has just assumed. And what that does amongst all the legal challenges is it creates a question of execution. Is this really going to make us safer to put Cole in charge of a metropolitan police force that's complex and which he has absolutely no training in running? That's the kind of thing I think we've seen from the Trump administration, whether it's Rubio, Besson, I mean, the list goes on, giving one person multiple jobs as opposed to using the people in place to the best of their ability. So to me, it's a question of execution. And I think this is not, the courts may have saved them here in a way by saying, wait a minute, we're not going to let this go forward for now.
Interesting to hear from the Attorney General of the District of Columbia, Rick, refer to this as the gravest threat to home rule the district has ever faced. You've been around this city for a minute. Is it true?
You know, it's hard to tell how this is all going to frame out. I mean, obviously, there's been a sea change in attitude of the District of Columbia government. The mayor, when all this was announced, sounded downright measured in her response and said that she was looking forward to working with the Trump administration to, create a safer city. Now it's the gravest threat to home rule within the last 24 hours. So there's a breakdown there somewhere. It doesn't have to be. I think that there are ways to make this work to the betterment of the people of the District of Columbia and those visiting. But it seems to be on a trajectory now where it's more confrontation than it is focused on the security.
You know, there was a legislative answer to this, Jeannie, before the president ever got involved, at least in the House, voting to nullify Washington, D.C.'s sanctuary city law and mandate full cooperation with the federal authorities, kind of like we're seeing now on the executive level. It's unclear where this goes in the Senate. Could that bill pass?
You know, at this point, I think it may be able to. It's hard to tell with Congress out right now. I think it's going to depend an awful lot on how this rolls out. But I really see a challenge for the Trump administration in terms of overreach. You know, when Gavin Newsom held his news conference yesterday in California about redistricting, you had FBI agents, you had federal authorities showing up with masks on for God knows what reason. And it's that kind of overreach there, the same kind of thing you're seeing in D.C. Yes, we need to cut back on crime. But the question is this the best way to do it? To tie the hands of the current police commissioner by saying that she has to get every single measure she wants to put in place to cut down on crime approved by the head of the DEA, who has another really big full-time job. So I think it's a message, a question of overreach for the Trump administration, and it's hurting him in the polls on things like immigration. People want to reduce crime, they want a safe border, but they don't necessarily want this fascist picture of FBI and federal agents in masks on the streets of our cities.
Well, they set up a checkpoint. We were just showing images of it a couple of moments ago on Bloomberg TV. It's up on 14th Street, 14th and W. Pulled a couple of people out of their cars, Rick, and they were arrested. But we're hearing from the administration that checkpoints like these could be set up all over the city in different areas and, in fact, could be used around the country. There's a good view of a law enforcement officer with the face mask on. If that is the case, you start wondering where this is going here, Rick, and the way that people are in fact going to react to this kind of sort of deliberate confrontation that police are having here. People came out of restaurants to scream at them and protest what was going on. It's just a different level from what we're used to seeing here in Washington. Can this continue? Is it sustainable?
You know, it's hard to tell from these anecdotal, mentions. I know that I've talked to a lot of friends. I grew up in Washington, in this area. Yeah. A lot of friends live in D.C. And by and large, most of them applaud the effort to try and create a safer city. I mean, people don't think D.C. is a safe place to go. And I don't think there's much of a debate around that. So it's really technical, right? I mean, if you want to have the federal government step in and help make it safer, how are they going to do that? It doesn't seem reasonable to me that the feds want to be seen as thugs on the street and almost compared to the people propagating the crime. So I don't get the strategy that the federal government is using here. And it may all revolve around immigration. This may just be a big cover to do more and more immigration roll-ups, which we know is a fundamental priority of the Trump administration. If that's the case, I agree with Jeannie, it will likely turn against them. If they actually are sincere in trying to make D.C. safer, I think it could be a positive.
Just a minute left, Jeannie. At that checkpoint, when the media was asking for comment, they were referred to the White House, not to D.C. police or even to the Department of Justice. Is that sustainable?
I don't see how. Particularly, you mentioned they are talking about spreading this around the country. I mean, it really starts to have this sense of a police state. And is the White House really going to be directing what's going on in our cities and towns across the country? It's not, doesn't sound very, Republican to me, or conservative. So it's definitely surprising. And I think many people from left, right, and center are going to find this objectionable. Yes, reduce crime. We've got great police officers to do that. Invest in them, train them, support them, but don't put federal authorities on the streets in masks and say everybody and everything has to go through the White House. The president has more than enough to do in Alaska right now.
Jeannie Sheehan Zaino and Rick Davis, we thank you. Our political panel is going to stay with us as we engage our special coverage with eyes on Anchorage, Alaska this evening, with conversations ahead, including Ian Kelly, former U.S. ambassador to Georgia, Melinda Haring of the Atlantic Council, and Bob McNally of Rapidan Energy Group. That's all in the next hour of this special extended edition of Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
This is Balance of Power, live from Washington, D.C.
From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, I'm Joe Matthew. Tonight, a special edition of Balance of Power, the Trump-Putin summit. 206 days into the second Trump term, 903 days since Russia invaded Ukraine. Vladimir Putin touching down in the U.S., shaking hands with the President of the United States, even taking a limo ride with the president and sitting down for an historic bilateral summit as both leaders look for a way forward on the war in Ukraine. The world remains transfixed on Anchorage tonight as we await a joint news conference with both Putin and Trump, waiting to learn of any headway on a potential solution to the war, despite Volodymyr Zelenskiy not being part of the discussions. All that and more in our special coverage of the Trump-Putin summit continuing on Bloomberg TV and radio. And we kick things off this hour with Bloomberg's Annmarie Hordern, who is traveling with the president, reporting live from Anchorage, Alaska. Annmarie is in the room right now where Presidents Trump and Putin will appear later for a news conference. And Annmarie, we're working our way now to hour 3. Should we take that as a good sign?
I think so, in the sense that they are actually having a dialogue. Remember, President Trump earlier said he'll know within minutes whether or not he can negotiate with this individual, and if not, he'll leave. So passing the 2.5-hour mark, this actually puts Trump and Putin well beyond the time they spent together in that one-on-one and narrow format than they did when they met in Helsinki. And this is according to Dan Scavino, one of the president's top aides. Following this 3-on-3 format, which is really foreign policy focused when you look at the individuals in the room, they're going to expand the dialogue when it comes to the U.S. and Russia delegations. You're going to have the Treasury Secretary there, the Finance Minister on the Russian side, the Commerce Minister, Commerce Secretary there on the U.S. side, and the defense minister on the Russian side. So that might take hours as well. We should note, Kremlin aide Dmitry Peskov did tell reporters earlier in the day that these talks may go on for 6 or 7 hours. And now we were basically past 2.5 hours, and we are not even halfway through the agenda that these two leaders set forth.
Fascinating, Annmarie. Maybe time to start bringing in the takeout. Let us know if that happens in Anchorage. Annmarie Hordern in Alaska. We'll check back with Annmarie throughout the evening. Joining us now for more on Balance of Power is Ian Kelly, the former U.S. ambassador to Georgia, current ambassador in residence at Northwestern University. Mr. Ambassador, welcome to Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm curious where your head is, having seen the optics here. A lot of smiles, a lot of handshaking, even a ride in the Beast before they went behind closed doors. This idea now of an expanded session, a working lunch with other members of the administration. Is this a sign of a productive day in Alaska?
Well, I think we're really only going to find that out when they emerge for the press conference. But the initial visuals of this were, for me, quite disturbing. I mean, it's one thing to agree to have face-to-face with a man who has invaded a sovereign country and committed or has been indicted for war crimes. And it's quite another thing to literally roll out the red carpet for him, to applaud him as he's approaching down the red carpet, and then give him a ride in the presidential limousine. I guess it's all worth it to treat him far better than he treated Vladimir Zelenskiy when he visited with Trump. It'll all be worth it if something comes out of it, but
it's a bit different than the reception that Zelenskiy got in the Oval Office, isn't it? I mean, you can speak to the protocol here. This looks like they're having a grand time, like their old friends getting together. What they discussed in the car, by the way, is a great question of mine, knowing that there was not a translator, and Vladimir Putin likely would have spoken English. Does it bother you to think they were alone for that period of time?
Well, it was only 10 minutes, I understand. But I think what concerned me is that you get the visual up there right now.
Understood.
Vladimir Putin is absolutely grinning there. They're having a great time. As you say, they look like they're old buddies getting together. It's just not a real good look for an American president dealing with an indicted war criminal.
Mm-hmm. We got word just as President Putin's plane touched down, and a pretty remarkable case of timing here at Bloomberg, that the U.S. is weighing sanctions against Rosneft and Lukoil if Vladimir Putin fails to agree to a ceasefire. Do you think President Trump is serious about putting that into effect as soon as today?
Well, I certainly hope so. I mean, there's been quite a bit of rhetoric and then multiple deadlines that have slid by without any action. If they don't get even a temporary ceasefire out of this, I would hope that they would lower the boom finally on one of the reasons, or one of the ways that this war is perpetuated, and that's the income stream from oil sales. And so I hope that they impose those secondary sanctions.
Well, I wonder your thoughts about that a bit more, to the extent that energy is a backdrop for this summit. We're going to talk with Bob McNally at Rapidan about later on this hour. The president has urged so much around energy production as a cornerstone of his administration and the American economy. Is he prepared to put secondary sanctions on the likes of India and China and move prices in a global market?
I think he has to. I mean, it really has come down to crunch time for him. Like I say, he's had all of these deadlines just pass by with no action. And he has said, if I don't think that that Putin is serious in stopping this war, I will impose some costs on him. So I think everybody's expecting it. We don't know how how deep they'll go. But
is that the best leverage that Donald Trump has today, that the president or the country has today, as opposed to dangling the carrot of normalized economic relations with the United States? And Scott Bessent is there. Howard Lutnick is there. They're going to talk business at this luncheon, Ambassador.
Yeah, and I'm concerned about that. I mean, you really shouldn't normalize relations, have a normal commercial relationship when all of your allies, of course, are continuing to isolate them and sanction them. It just is. It's not a good message to Putin that he can get away with war crimes and then enjoy a broadened commercial relationship. The other leverage, of course, that the president has is, of course, supplying Ukraine with arms that will have a real bite, some missiles with range and other types of long-range artillery.
Mm-hmm. Give us a sense of what will pique your antennas, what will get your attention, and what we should watch for and listen for when these two men emerge from this meeting and stand before reporters today. It's the first time we've seen this since Helsinki.
Yeah, so I mean, a lot of it will be body language. I think we saw some disturbing body language in Helsinki when they first met. But I think what I'll be looking for is Putin finally agreeing unconditionally to a ceasefire. It can only really be a temporary ceasefire because that's what the Ukrainians have already agreed to. They agreed to it months ago. There's not much more that he could do without doing real damage to the alliance and to Ukraine in particular if he tries to dictate terms that he's agreed to with Putin. So I'm hoping it's just that, something that the Ukrainians have already said they're comfortable with.
We're seeing a bit of activity there in the briefing room where press has gathered, apparently with some uniformed members of the military, remembering, of course, this is on a joint U.S. military base. When they do emerge, of course, we'll bring this conversation to you live and unfiltered here on Bloomberg TV and radio. Ambassador, having been a diplomat yourself, what's happening inside that room as they wrap things up? Or will there be a photograph? Do they shake hands and walk out and see reporters? Who walks in the room first?
You know, I normally, and this is a president who doesn't always follow the normal procedures for diplomatic events like this, but normally they would, if they've agreed to do a joint press conference, they would agree sort of general press lines, so they're talking from the same song sheet, and then they would just go out onto the podium. I mean, obviously, if only President Trump shows up, or if only President Putin shows up, that's a sign that that the United States has not been able to get what they want, which is a ceasefire.
Yeah. Really appreciate your view this evening. Ian Kelly, former U.S. ambassador to Georgia. We thank you for joining us. Speaking of Helsinki and the last bilateral meeting between these two men, the most recent summit, 2018, I spoke on the early edition of Balance of Power with a man who was in the room that day, John Bolton, the former national security advisor to President Trump in his first term, former U.S. ambassador to the UN. And I started by asking him what was going through the president's head before walking into this summit.
Well, I think Trump obviously has it in mind. The circumstances are very different. The stakes really are a lot higher here with a lot for the two leaders to talk about. starts out, I think, very favorable to Putin. He's been pulled out of international PERDA and given a spotlight next to the president, hasn't paid anything for that privilege. And the real question is whether he can work his KGB training to bring Trump back into the bubble of believing he and Vladimir are good friends again. So a lot rides on it for Ukraine, a lot rides on it for U.S.-Russian relations, and really any number of related issues around the world.
It was said earlier on this program, John Bolton, that the president does not have the guardrails around him today that he had in 2018 in Helsinki. We're looking at images from that meeting, and namely, he doesn't have you. He's traveling today with the likes of Steve Witkoff, Howard Lutnick, John Ratcliffe, Marco Rubio is there. For some reason, the Secretary of Defense has stayed here in Washington, but these are widely seen as loyalists who are not going to check the president when he's talking to Vladimir Putin. Is that how you see it?
Well, I think the lesson Donald Trump drew from his first term is that he wants to be surrounded by people who just say yes, sir, or no, sir. And that ultimately will not work out well for him. It certainly won't work out well for the country. The purpose of advisors is to give advice. It's not just to do the first thing that comes out of the boss's mouth. And I think anybody would tell you it's not because they're trying to steer him in one direction or another necessarily, or they're trying to make the decision themselves. It's to make sure the president has all the information he needs to make an informed choice, and to give him a range of options with their respective pros and cons. I don't think Trump is encumbered by that sort of preparation for this. He rarely reads his briefing materials. He said, and I think it's an accurate self-description, he'll know within the first few minutes in his mind whether there's going to be progress made at this meeting or not.
You say he rarely reads his briefing materials. How does President Trump prepare for an historic summit like this?
Well, he doesn't think it's necessary to know a lot about the subject matter because he's the master of the art of the deal, and he looks at his counterpart on the other side of the table, and you know, the magic occurs, and a deal comes or it doesn't come. When I accompanied to the summit in Helsinki in 2018, we were flying from his estate at Turnberry in Scotland to Helsinki, and I briefed him on strategic nuclear weapons negotiations in his office on the plane while he was watching a FIFA soccer championship.
Oh my God. I'm just going to leave that right there. What's he going to be walking into? Is it the charm offensive that we've been hearing so much about? And are we overstating the abilities, the influence of Vladimir Putin as if he has some sort of KGB Jedi mind trick that he'll employ today?
Well, there's no guarantee Putin will succeed. In fact, I think part of the reason he's in the position he is now is that he pierced whatever Trump's comfort envelope was in terms of their friendship. And Trump has said he's been disappointed with Putin. He's used stronger language. And now really the burden is on Putin to try and get that back. It's not just flattery, although that's always useful with Trump, but it really is the training, the experience of a KGB agent to size people up and manipulate him. And I would give Putin high marks and maybe even better marks than Trump in being able to size up an adversary and know how to bend them to your will. Putin started yesterday after the inoculation by the Europeans on Wednesday with Trump to try and make sure he didn't go off the rails today with Putin. Putin said yesterday he was just impressed with the energy and sincerity of the president's effort to bring peace to Ukraine, and he looked forward to discussing a whole range of issues like nuclear arms control. So that's the influence technique beginning to work. We'll see how it plays out.
When you were standing there in Helsinki, the two presidents came out to talk to reporters, and you heard Donald Trump say, "President Putin says it's not Russia. I don't see any reason why it would be." What went through your mind?
Well, I was frozen to my seat, but it was pretty clear immediately this was a major disaster. And as soon as the press conference was over, I got back on the phone to Washington. And before I could even say hello to my deputy to ask what the reaction was, she said that all hell had broken loose just in the few minutes between Trump's comment and the time it took me to get outside away from everybody else to make a call on a cell phone. So that was a moment that I don't think anybody will forget. A good press conference for Trump today would be that absolutely nothing comes out of it.
Fantastic. That's really interesting because you said earlier Vladimir Putin hasn't paid for this right, not only to have the meeting, John, but to have the news conference all over again. We're going to replay these optics today. And the narrative that we've been hearing is that Vladimir Putin has already won because of this stage that he'll share with Donald Trump. Is that how you feel?
Yeah, I mean, Trump could throw a fit. There's no doubt about it. And he has learned over time that you can walk away without good news. He walked away from Kim Jong-un, the North Korean leader, after the meeting in Hanoi in 2019. At least we didn't make a bad nuclear deal with North Korea. And Trump himself said, you know, if I leave early and have a press conference by myself, you'll know it turned out badly.
Yeah. You can find my full conversation with John Bolton, the former national security advisor to President Trump, who was in the room in Helsinki, online or on the terminal. I do want to mention the reference to Pete Hegseth. The defense secretary was not on the list provided to media for those traveling on Air Force One, and that turns out to be for a reason. He apparently took his own airplane to Alaska and was, in fact, part of the delegation. We're still waiting to hear about Tulsi Gabbard. Now, we've had a number of headlines cross just in the past couple of seconds, and I can tell you with a headline on the terminal that the talks have ended. Here we are at 6:17 p.m. Eastern Time, and much earlier than we had thought at one point today. Putin-Trump talks are over. According to pool reporters, the Kremlin now says narrow format talks are over, and we're showing you a live view of the press briefing room, which suddenly saw a burst of activity about 5 minutes ago when reporters got the word that this meeting had in fact concluded. At any moment now, Presidents Trump and Putin could emerge. You see the backdrop on Bloomberg TV, on YouTube, Pursuing Peace, two podia with presidential seals, American and Russian flags, all the trappings of a formal summit and bilateral news conference that we're about to see. Reporters are still milling around. It looks like some of the network TV anchors still have live shots to do, so it could be a couple of moments here before we get started. When we do, you will hear this complete with translation as if you were in the room right here on Bloomberg. Now, earlier this week, I spoke with retired General Philip Breedlove, the former NATO Supreme Allied Commander. We talked about the potential impact of secondary sanctions. Listen.
I really believe that we should continue the sanctions because they are having some effect on Russia, on the Russian people, on the Russian economy. But sanctions have never changed Mr. Putin's approach to the battlefield. And that's the most important thing we need to do now. We need to change his approach to the battlefield.
Now for a closer look at those sanctions and the impact they're having on the Russian economy, Bloomberg's Vonnie Quinn joins us live from World Headquarters in New York. Vonnie, it's good to have you. How have sanctions impacted Russia's economy?
Well, if we go back to the beginning,
some or all are lifted, would changes see economies impacted around the globe?
Oh, for sure, Joe, depending on what happens next. Let's go back to the beginning of the war and see exactly how these nearly 5,000 sanctions on companies and people and individuals affected U.S. trade with Russia. As you can see from this chart, down 90% and pretty much immediately. Now, that had an impact. It doesn't mean that Russia didn't have export customers, right? It had to find other allies, other byways, but it managed to, China and India being the big ones. Now, you saw, obviously, Donald Trump threatened to put secondary tariffs on India in order to punish India for buying Russian oil. Those aren't due to take place for another 2 weeks. Will they actually take place? We'll have to see, but it's certainly out there, and the precedent is Venezuela, of course. Trump did do that with Venezuela back in March, so he does have a precedent for following through. UBS, however, telling us that it would be actually enacting these secondary sanctions that would have an impact and not just the threat of them when it comes to oil markets. Let's take a look at oil markets from the beginning of the war, right before the war even, until now, because you are seeing that we had this massive spike in prices and they've come back down. And Brent crude, for example, trading now in the low $60 a barrel. We'll have to see what happens when it comes to oil markets, but just in terms of the Russian economy, you are seeing the ruble also back to pre-war levels, which means that people are obviously feeling the power of the ruble again. So at one point it was extraordinarily weak, as you can see from the chart, and their purchasing power would have been eroded. That purchasing power is now back, and tourism to Southeast Asian nations, for example, is 100% higher than it was last year in some cases. So there are pockets of the economy that are still quite strong. I do want to refer, though, to something that Halima Croft said at RBC Capital Markets when, thinking about how this might progress. She said that if sanctions relief is offered, and obviously it's going to be part of the conversation, there are limits to how much can be done without buy-in from Europe, because after all, it's Europe that has most of the energy sanctions targeting Russian energy exports. But she also points this out, which is extremely interesting, that President Trump's trade policy places enhanced market access for US energy exports at the heart of his deal-making. In other words, he's got Europe to promise to buy US exports of natural gas and oil. Where would that leave Russia? If Russia wanted Europe to be a buyer of its natural gas again and its oil again, and Europe were to drop its sanctions, well, that's sort of a conflict of interest, right, between what the United States wants for itself and what Russia wants for itself. So there's a lot to think about here when it comes to either dialing up sanctions or dialing down sanctions.
Sure sounds like it, Vonnie. Great work. Bloomberg's Vonnie Quinn helping us walk through our special coverage with her eyes on the markets. We'll check back with you throughout the evening here. Just to update things, we're standing by for a news conference that is set to begin at any moment now with President Trump and Vladimir Putin, the bilateral presser that we've been talking about here. There's a live shot on Bloomberg TV and on YouTube. If you're with us on Bloomberg Radio, the podiums are set. The backdrop is in place. The media has filed into the room, and White House staff has also just now filled the front rows, giving us a sense that this is about to begin. But we want to stick with this beat on energy. For more on the summit's impact on the oil markets, we bring in Bob McNally, the founder and president of Rapidan Energy Group. Bob, it's always great to have you as part of our coverage, and I'll apologize in advance if we have to interrupt our conversation for this news conference. We've been watching crude oil kind of sit in place around $65 a barrel now for some time, at least in terms of West Texas, down around 63 today. This does not seem like a market that's got a lot of jitters ahead of this particular session. What are the outcomes that make you worried? All right, not hearing Bob. I guess, Bob, if you're muted, maybe you can take that on your end, because we want to hear what Bob is talking about here with crude oil futures settling just below $63 a barrel. What's keeping you up at night, Bob, as we wait to hear from these two leaders? I guess we don't have Bob McNally with us here as we try to get a sense of what this might mean in terms of secondary sanctions, for instance, and other sanctions against the buyers of Russian oil. We'll assemble our panel now as we walk into this historic moment. Bloomberg Politics contributors Jeannie Shanzano and Rick Davis are with us. Rick, this is the moment of truth here. I'm not sure your thoughts on the so-called narrow format and the brevity of this session after Russia projected 6 to 7 hours potentially of work at the table today. They've wrapped up. They're now in their separate quarters. What are we about to hear?
Yeah, I would have thought that if it was going to be more productive, in other words, like, actually coming to an agreement on parameters around a ceasefire, it would have taken some time. I can't believe that Putin would have come with a plan to agree to a ceasefire. Donald Trump kind of felt and speculated in advance he's there to listen to Putin. I suspect Putin was in the same mindset. He's there to listen to Trump. What's your deal? So the fact that it didn't last that long and that these two sides are preparing to go forward, and it doesn't sound like they're working together on a communique that would be endorsed by both. So this I think, could be a very interesting presser that we're about to be exposed to, momentarily.
What do you think about this, Jeannie, and to what extent will these two world leaders be reading off the same sheet?
Yeah, it's really unclear. And I was very surprised to hear that it was over this quickly on the one hand. And then when you step back and think about it from a 30,000 foot level, not that much, because I give the President Trump, credit for seeming to stick to his guns on the fact that he was going to talk in these 3-on-3 meetings about Ukraine and not be diverted to other things like the economy, like ways of working together on energy or nuclear agreements. And I think if Russia was held to talking about Ukraine, there's very little, as far as we can see, movement for them to go forward, because they have really stuck to what they've said since Istanbul. So it could, of course, be good news, perhaps, that they have agreed to a second meeting. We really don't know. But to Rick's point, if there was a concerted effort to discuss a ceasefire, whether partial or full, you would just suspect that would take a bit more time than we've seen here. But again, I think we're going to be surprised. And quite frankly, Joe, it's historic. And this whole day is surprising from start to finish with how quick this thing seems to have wrapped up.
Yeah. Rick, does a short meeting also mean a short news conference?
Not necessarily. Donald Trump is renowned now for waxing poetic from a podium in the Oval Office or anywhere else, entertaining question after question. We know that Vladimir Putin isn't keen to open up and allow questioning of his regime. So my guess is it would be actually a really enjoyable evening if Donald Trump forces Vladimir Putin to spend an hour in front of the international press having to answer for the crimes that he's committed on the Ukrainian people and the mismanagement of the Russian Republic.
Jeannie, we remember Helsinki, and we were just talking about it with John Bolton. To what extent will that experience inform Donald Trump's choice of words and body language tonight?
I think it has been front of mind for Donald Trump. Many people have said that when he came in this second time, he really made those promises on the campaign trail to end this in 24 hours because he believed that he and Putin had a special relationship, and that he has been pretty stunned by the fact that at every turn, even though he's given Putin a lot of room to maneuver and he has made positive overtures, that he has been rebuffed and his demands have been largely ignored. At one point, he was apparently asking people on his staff and people who know Putin what was wrong with him, with some people speculating that something had happened during COVID. And I think that's why Donald Trump, who likes to be very open about how he feels, has been saying, I'll know within the first few minutes whether this is going to be a go in terms of reaching a ceasefire or not. And potentially, we don't know, but potentially that's what we'll hear, that when they got in the beast and they were alone within 2 seconds, and Donald Trump's telling, he could sense that this was not going to go in the direction that he wanted it to go. And that may be, and again, I need to underscore, may be what we're going to see here. So I think for Donald Trump, the Helsinki experience, which many people say was one of the lowest points in his first administration foreign policy-wise, has really weighed heavily on him. And I don't think he wants to repeat that.
Bolton called it the darkest day of the first term when we spoke with him. If you're just joining us on Bloomberg TV and radio, this is special live coverage of the Trump-Putin summit in Anchorage, Alaska. That meeting has ended after a couple of hours of work behind closed doors. We are now waiting for these two leaders to emerge with a live view of the stage on Bloomberg TV and on YouTube. Reporters filed into the room a short time ago along with White House staff, so it's unclear exactly when this will begin, but we do get a sense that it will be imminently, and we are also watching the schedule change before our eyes, having thought this could take place hours later, which brings an interesting wrinkle to this whole conversation. Rick Davis and Jeannie Shanzano, Bloomberg Politics contributors, will stay with us as the world awaits this news conference. We add the voice of Melinda Haring, non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. Melinda, it's great to have you tonight. We couldn't do this without having your view, because you spoke with us here on Bloomberg the day that Russia invaded Ukraine, and you've been providing analysis from your trips to Kyiv and throughout Ukraine ever since. I cannot imagine what went through your mind when you saw Vladimir Putin get in the presidential limousine. This is not the way you saw this happening a couple of years ago, is it?
No. Hey, Joe, it's great to be with you. Thanks for a chance to be here. And as an Alaskan, I'm particularly interested in this moment. There are about 400 or 500 Alaskans outside of this picture that your viewers see, and they have one of the largest Ukrainian flags in the U.S. They're holding it, and they're telling Trump and they're telling Putin that they don't approve of this. I don't expect anything significant to happen tonight, but like you said, this meeting has been shortened, and it's possible that Putin agreed to something, that Trump threatened him, that he offered him some kind of economic incentive, some kinds of sanctions relief, and Putin said, okay, fine, I will engage in some kind of ceasefire. But on the ground tonight, Joe, there is no ceasefire. The bombings are still there. There's no change of behavior, and Putin still thinks he's winning. So I don't see how this summit is going to amount to anything new. It's Alaskan fool's gold, just to cut to the chase.
Well, fascinating. Melinda, hundreds of Alaskans gathered in Anchorage, not far, maybe about 10 miles from where this is occurring at the joint base, to protest what's going on here. I think a lot of us have learned over the past couple of days about the several thousand Ukrainians who actually live in Alaska. They don't want to see a freezing of lines. They don't want to see a land grab. They do want to see a ceasefire. What would make them happy in this news conference? Because when you hear Moscow refer to the narrow format talks ending after a brief period of time, we're assuming there's no breakthrough here, right?
Right, Joe. The thing that everyone is watching for tonight is the word ceasefire. This is the word that Volodymyr Zelenskiy said, I want to hear the word ceasefire. And Trump himself said it on Air Force One that he was going to push for a ceasefire agreement. So I think that's the number one word to listen for. Number two is security guarantee. So if Putin agrees to stop a ceasefire, and it has to be multi-layered. It has to be air, it has to be land, and it has to be sea, and it has to have some kind of guarantee. There also has to be a security guarantee so that Russia can't attack Ukraine again. And we know that NATO is off the table. President Trump, though, has talked about giving Ukraine enough weapons to make it a porcupine, so it's so painful to attack again. So that's something else I'm going to be listening for. Has Trump finally gotten frustrated? We saw over the last 6 weeks, Trump was increasingly frustrated as Putin hit cities across Ukraine with almost glee. Joe, I calculated the numbers, and there's an 800% increase between June 2024 and June 2025 in terms of the number of rockets and drones that have struck Ukraine. 800%.
As we spend time with Melinda Haring from the Atlantic Council, it's about, well, just after 6:30 p.m. Eastern time now. That would make it roughly 2:30 p.m. local time in Anchorage, where it's 59 degrees and sunny skies, an August Friday in Alaska. Not exactly what you would think of when you consider Anchorage. Melinda, this was put together very much at the last minute. They had less than a week, essentially, to plan the logistics behind this important summit. And I wonder if we're going to see the protocol with President Trump and Vladimir Putin that we would normally see. A couple of questions from each side here, maybe simultaneous translation. Will it matter what Putin says or what Donald Trump says tonight?
Joe, one of the interesting things that we've seen is the warm receptions. So we saw them hugging. They seemed to be very happy. We saw Putin jump in the Beast, the American limousine, and they're carrying on like old chums. So I think the theatrics are important. And honestly, Joe, Moscow could not be more delighted. They are on par. They have been forgiven. They've been whitewashed, whatever analogy you want to use. Putin is wanted by the International Criminal Court, and that doesn't seem to matter. His plane landed on sovereign U.S. territory, and there's no consequences. We saw uniformed military, U.S. military officers roll a red carpet and bend down in front of the Russian presidential plane. It's hard to compete with those images. People in Russia are delighted, and I can tell you tonight, the mood in Kiev is one of apprehension and worry. People are very worried that Donald Trump is going to agree to give land to Trump in exchange for some kind of ceasefire. But I think it's important, Joe, to remind your listeners, This is not Trump's land to give away, and Ukrainians have to agree to this. Ukrainians and Europeans, to state the obvious, are not in Anchorage. They're not part of these discussions, and the Ukrainian constitution mandates a referendum. All Ukrainians have to agree on it in order to give up land. So any kind of land exchange that's agreed on in Anchorage is illegitimate, and it's not going to be backed up. The Ukrainians will not back it, and the Europeans will not back it. So, well, if they're talking about some kind of land agreement, it's a fiction.
Yeah. Melinda, stay with us as we bring in Nick Wadhams here in Washington. Nick runs our national security coverage here at Bloomberg in D.C., and it's great to have you, Nick. The optics here are fascinating as we wait for this to begin. Melinda was just talking about the red carpet rolled out at Joint Base Elmendorf. This was, it's home of the third wing of the Air Force. We saw the jets, the F-22 fighter jets out there on the runway. In the old days, this was a critical monitoring post for the U.S. to keep an eye on the Soviet Union, and in fact carried the nickname Top Cover for North America. The idea that Vladimir Putin would be getting the king's treatment on this particular plot of land is pretty remarkable, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, the symbolism of this whole meeting is just extraordinary because, you know, for so long, the U.S. has joined Western allies in trying to essentially isolate Vladimir Putin and not give him a kind of meeting like this that he craves. That symbolic isolation where the only leaders he's able to talk to, China, India, or some others, but not the Western nations that explicitly are isolating him as a way of showing their support for Ukraine, that has just been demolished. So a really potent piece of symbolism there. Then you have these images of them walking down the red carpet and getting into the beast, the presidential limo with the president, and an extremely friendly handshake. I mean, it looks certainly like they're practically old friends.
A reunion.
Exactly. It looks like a reunion. Then you have the flyover by the B-2 bombers, and then they drive past these F-22 jets and the helicopters, and it's like, well, is this meant as a sort of show of force to intimidate Vladimir Putin, or is it meant as like, hey, look at all my toys, and sort of showing off U.S. might as a way of just of being almost a boastful reflection of Trump's power itself? So there's a lot to digest here, but certainly the big thing for me is this idea that just Vladimir Putin was out in the cold and he's really being pulled back in the cold from the cold by President Trump.
It's feeling pretty warm in Alaska today, as I mentioned. We're in the 60s here. Obviously, they've gone to their separate quarters here before they emerge. I suspect they're speaking with staff about the way they want to frame things. Rick Davis had mentioned earlier the expected lack of a joint communique or a joint readout. Is that something we should just get used to? You watch Truth Social to find out the American version, wait to hear from the Kremlin for the Moscow version.
Yeah, I mean, the readout culture under the Trump administration is just so different than it ever was before. I mean, in past presidencies, what you would have expected was that essentially all the groundwork, the brush clearing, the heavy lifting would have been done in advance, and then you would have the two presidents come in and sort of dot the T's and cross the I's, or if there was that one thing that only the president could drag across the line, that's the place that they would do it. But if there were a joint communique, that thing would basically be written long in advance of the meeting and worked out between the Sherpas, the officials of the two sides. Of course, now we know on the U.S. side, that sort of mid-level range of Russia expert largely is gone. Those officials are not there. And it's basically up to President Trump. So I think we'll probably, I'm surprised even that there's this much delay before the press conference, because it's like, well, what does President Trump need to prepare for in a way, given that he's clearly going to be speaking extemporaneously for a lot of this.
That's the style, right? As we spend time with Nick Wadhams, Melinda Haring, and our political panel, I want to bring Rick and Jeannie back into the conversation. Rick Davis, you had mentioned the lack of a joint communique. Does that mean that we could actually have conflicting messages on this stage tonight?
Oh, I'm highly anticipating it and downright giddy over it, because nothing is going to make better theater across the world stage than a disagreement on what needs to happen with Ukraine between Vladimir Putin and President Trump. Look, Vladimir Putin has put himself in a very, very bad spot. Everybody's been talking about, Vladimir Putin's having the best of times. He thought he would be the sole owner of the entire country of Ukraine by now. This has been a war that has taken an enormous toll on his troops, his economy, his country, and his prestige around the world. And sure, there's a little bit of oxygen being given to him by Donald Trump today. But if Trump shuts the door on that, and starts to fund Ukraine, both militarily and economically, and imposes, in his terms, severe sanctions, especially these secondary sanctions we've all been talking about, this could look like the worst possible thing that could have happened to Putin. We can only hope that that's where we wind up.
Well, it'll be interesting to actually witness this. Jeannie, your concerns about conflicting messages or maybe Donald Trump turned off by what he hears, remembering he was going to end this war in 24 hours and said recently that Putin just keeps tapping me along. He's always nice on the phone, but then the bombing continues as soon as we hang up. Why would he trust what he hears from that person?
It's hard to imagine how he could or why he would. But I think for me, what is so stunning about this is almost nobody knows where Donald Trump stands. I mean, in the last 6 months, he has pretty much been on all sides of this issue. You know, his attack on Vladimir Zelenskiy and the White House, the amount of cushion and carrots he has granted to President Putin, including this visit. He may come out and that may be the Donald Trump we see. On the other hand, he may come out and he may be the Donald Trump who, just in the last few hours has said, we are going to focus on Ukraine and we're not going to do quote unquote business at this point. He may be the Donald Trump who's been talking to our European allies and Vladimir Zelenskiy. It is just stunning to me that we have a president of the United States and almost nobody can accurately predict what is going to come out of his mouth when he takes that stage. And so to Rick's point, it makes very good theater. I'm not sure how good public policy or foreign policy it really makes to have this amount of uncertainty hanging over something this important. So that to me is particularly troubling.
If you're just joining us on Bloomberg TV and radio, this is special extended coverage on balance of power of the Trump-Putin summit in Anchorage, Alaska. I'm Joe Matthew in Washington. We have our eyes on Anchorage and a stage that has been set up for these two men to meet the press. That could happen at any moment. Their meeting running just roughly 3 hours or so behind closed doors. That meeting has concluded. Narrow format talks as framed by the Kremlin a short time ago. President Trump and President Putin will be taking questions. It's unclear for how long once they emerge. We've built a stable of great voices for you this evening to help understand what is happening and what's about to happen, including Nick Wadhams with me here at Bloomberg in Washington, Melinda Haring at the Atlantic Council, and Bloomberg Politics contributors Rick Davis and Jeannie Shanzano. Melinda, there's been talk about business being had at this meeting. The Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent, the Commerce Secretary, Howard Lutnick, along with Steve Witkoff, of course, both in tow, to essentially toy with the idea of normalizing economic relations with Russia. What other reason would they be there for?
Hi, Joe. I think you nailed it. So it's interesting when you look at who's with Trump, and there's a lot more economic experience than foreign policy experience. That was the first thing that jumped out to me. So his team, his Commerce Secretary and his Treasury Secretary are there to offer some kind of deal. The Telegraph revealed that they've talked about a rare earth deal. They've talked about sanctions relief. I think that they're trying to see what's possible in order to get a ceasefire, and that's what we're going to find out very soon. But let me go back to one point that your other esteemed guest made. I think that it's absolutely correct that we don't know which way Donald Trump is going to go. He's been all over the place in the last 6 weeks. He's hardened his position on Trump, and we also see he's hardened his position on Putin, and we also see public opinion changing. The Chicago Council on Global Affairs just released a poll. It's really interesting. It says that 61% of Americans favor more support for Ukraine. This is the highest in the last 2 years. And interestingly, 51% of Republicans also support Ukraine, assistance to Ukraine. Joe, 6 months ago, that figure was 30%. So we see that Donald Trump has more ability to with his base. His base is with him, and if he wants to go there, he has that ability.
Nick, I want your thoughts on this as well. The extent to which business is being discussed. Does this give President Trump an upper hand? This is the very thing that Vladimir Putin wants. If anything would justify his changing his mind in Ukraine, it would be doing business with America, right?
Well, yeah, I mean, there's a lot of sort of complicated dynamics to this whole thing because the sanctions have certainly been crippling, the sanctions that were imposed since 2022. I mean, they have really put a chokehold on the Russian economy. But at the same time, Vladimir Putin has shown his ability to continue to prosecute this war. And there are a lot of experts who would actually argue that the sanctions economy has actually strengthened Vladimir Putin's power. So, yes, you can make the argument on the one hand that, President Putin is coming into this. He certainly wants that economic relief, and that's a carrot that President Donald Trump could offer him. But so many of these sanctions also are congressionally mandated, and President Trump would face a fair amount of opposition if he were to come out and just say, okay, you know what, I'm going to lift these sanctions. So, yes, you do have the sort of the split screen element of the fact that Howard Lutnick is going, Scott Bessent is going. But we did report today that President Trump is also coming potentially with a message of saying, listen, if you don't agree to the ceasefire, I'm going to go even harder with these sanctions, as Rick was suggesting could be a possibility. So continued, secondary tariffs essentially on China for buying Russian oil, sanctions on Russian oil producers. But the challenge there is, how much can you really do and to further squeeze the economy of Russia to change Vladimir Putin's calculus? Right. It's tough. It's going to be really tough to do. So that's the choice that Trump faces coming into this.
Jeannie Shanzano, we've been talking about the potential for secondary tariffs for a couple of years now here on Balance of Power. If Joe Biden had applied them when he had the opportunity, would this war still be underway?
I don't think so, because I don't see how that actually works. Could it have somewhat of an impact? Sure. But for instance, the talk of a secondary tariff or a sanction on, say, China, we depend on China. We cannot do that to ourselves. And he's tariffed India to 50%. That can certainly have an impact. But there's also long-term impacts of this on our foreign policy with allies like India going forward. So, I think last week when the president set the deadline and then blew it again on Friday, I think it was actually, an understanding or a sense that for all his bluster on this as a stick that he's going to use, and he may come out and try to use it right now, I just don't see it as being particularly ineffective. And I don't know anybody who thinks that Vladimir Putin found himself in Alaska today and suddenly gave up on his interest in his belief that Ukraine is part of Russia. And I'm not sure he's at an economic point or certainly a military point where his back is against the wall and he's going to be forced to. And I've never been convinced that those sanctions and those tariffs were going to get us there. So, the president has that problem as we look at what can he possibly do. Can he do it? Sure. I just don't see it being particularly effective in getting a ceasefire or certainly ending this war at this point.
Well, we have to remember that Alaska was also at one time part of Russia. Rick, look, this could go on, obviously, for some time. And we should note, by the way, that the roughly a 2.5-hour summit here was the longest in-person meeting between these two, even as we remark on how brief it was, considering expectations. But, Rick, it does seem that these two men have different audiences. Is Vladimir Putin's purely domestic, or will he be speaking to the people of Ukraine?
Well, I think that Vladimir Putin wants to show the world that, he's strong, that he's in charge, not just of the Russian people, but of the sort of authoritarian bloc around the world. Remember, he only occupies space in non-democratic, non-Western societies where he is currently considered a international outcast and criminal. So he doesn't have that big a branch to talk from. But at the end of the day, I think it's more what his ambitions are, both personally and for what he would consider Mother Russia, right? I mean, he's not looking to cut a deal that will hem him into the Donetsk portions of Ukraine. He has ambitions throughout the Baltics, throughout Eastern Europe. And he's exercised those year in and year out, regardless of how many sanctions he's had. And the conclusion you have to make is until at which point in time he's met with force, that the rest of these things will not be enough on their own to elicit a change. And that's a change either in his behavior or the structure of the Russian government.
Rick Davis and Jeannie Shanzano with us, our political panel, as we get back to Melinda Haring and a news headline from Fox News. Melinda, Donald Trump seen speaking with President Zelenskiy via phone as we wait for him to emerge on the stage here. What was the tone and tenor of that call?
Joe, that was actually a decent call. You know, it's hard to forget that image that we talked a lot about back in February, that hostile meeting in the White House. But over the past couple of months, we've seen Zelenskiy and Trump really repair their relationship. And in fact, they seem to be getting along quite well. And Trump seems to understand the nightly bombings and the impact that they're having on the Ukrainian people and on the economy there. So I think the relationship has fundamentally changed in the past, I'd say, 6 to 8 weeks.
Melinda Haring at the Atlantic Council. Thank you so much, Melinda. What we're seeing right now in the room is important. If you're with us on Bloomberg TV or on YouTube, if we look at the individuals who just walked into the room, they include Howard Lutnick, the Commerce Secretary, Scott Bessent, the Treasury Secretary. We also saw Sergei Lavrov, the foreign minister, just sit down in the front row. Looks like Pete Hegseth is there as well. And CIA Director Ratcliffe. These are some of the highest-ranking lieutenants that arrived in Anchorage today with President Trump. And in the case of Lavrov, Vladimir Putin, Chief of Staff Susie Wiles, also in the front row now, as these reporters have been waiting for some time. In fact, for most of the day. There's Steve Witkoff, the special envoy, and Secretary of State Marco Rubio now also taking their seats. Those were the two gentlemen who were in the room with Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin. Now that the phone call to Zelensky has taken place and the president's nearest advisors who were taking part in this summit have arrived in the room, it's just Putin and Trump now who we are waiting to see. American and Russian flags have been set up flanking both ends, both sides of the stage, with two podiums and a backdrop that reads "Pursuing Peace." And I do find the language there curious, as President Trump did frame this as the start of negotiations, not necessarily promising a breakthrough, i.e. reaching peace. We're going to bring this conversation to you live, as we've promised throughout the day here, in our extended special coverage on Bloomberg TV and radio, joined for analysis by Bloomberg Politics contributors Rick Davis and Jeannie Shanzano, backed by the full editorial resources of Bloomberg News. We are on the ground in Anchorage, as you can see, back here in Washington, D.C., and around the country with Bloomberg editors and reporters also in New York, where Vonnie Quinn is watching the market reaction. As I mentioned, Rick Davis and Jeannie Shanzano are with us. I will hesitate to spend too much time here, guys, because I don't want to cut you off. But this is the moment of truth, Rick. When you're backstage, the cameras are up, people's eyes are up on the stage. The world is watching. I presume that Donald Trump, as the host today, will have the first words. How does this begin?
Yeah, I think Donald Trump will probably use it to frame the outcome of the meeting. Looks like you're about to get started now.
That's right. Rick, you're looking at this with us as well. Let's bring you in the room now. Anchorage, Alaska. Donald Trump at the podium, just giving a hand over to Vladimir Putin now. Let's listen live to the president of Russia.
Our negotiations have been held in a constructive atmosphere of mutual respect. We have very thorough negotiations that were quite useful. I would like to thank once again my American counterpart for the proposal to travel out here to Alaska. It only makes sense that we've met here, because our countries, though separated by the oceans, are close neighbors. So when we've met, when I came out of the plane and I've said, "Good afternoon, dear neighbor. Very good to see you. In good health and to see you alive." I think that is very neighborly. And I think that's some kind words that we can say to each other. We're separated by the Strait of Bering, though there are 2 islands only between the Russian island and the U.S. island. They're only 4 kilometers apart. We're close neighbors, and it's a fact. It's also important that Alaska has to do with our common heritage, common history between Russia and the U.S., and many positive events have to do with that territory. Still, there is tremendous cultural heritage back from the Russian America. For example, Orthodox churches and a lot of, more than 700 geographical names of Russian origin. During the Second World War, it was here in Alaska that was the origin of the legendary air bridge for the supply of military aircraft and other equipment under the Lend-Lease program. It was a dangerous and treacherous route over the vast emptiness of ice. However, the pilots of both countries did everything to bring closer the victory. They risked their lives and they gave it all for the common victory. I was just in the city of Magadan in Russia, and there is a memorial there dedicated to the Russian and the U.S. pilots. And there are 2 flags, the U.S. flag and the Russian flag. And I know that here as well, there is such a memorial. There is a military burial place several kilometers away from here. The Soviet pilots are buried there who died during that dangerous mission. We're thankful to the citizens and the government of the U.S. for carefully taking care of their memory. I think that's very worthy and noble. We'll always remember other historical examples when our countries defeated common enemies together in the spirit of battle camaraderie and allyship that supported each other and facilitated each other. I'm sure that this heritage will help us rebuild and foster mutually beneficial and equal ties at this new stage, even during the hardest conditions. It is known that there have been no summits between Russia and the U.S. for 4 years, and that's a long time. This time was very hard for bilateral relations, and let's be frank, they've fallen to the lowest point since the Cold War. I think that's not benefiting our countries and the world as a whole. It is apparent that sooner or later, we had to amend the situation to move on from the confrontation to dialogue. And in this case, a personal meeting between the heads of state has been long overdue. Naturally, under the condition of serious and painstaking work, and this work has been done in general. Me and President Trump have very good direct contact. We've spoken multiple times. We spoke frankly on the phone. And special envoy of the president, Mr. Witkoff, traveled out to Russia several times. Our advisors and heads of foreign ministries kept in touch all the time. And you know fully well that one of the central issues was the situation around Ukraine. We see the strive of the administration and President Trump personally to help facilitate the resolution of the Ukrainian conflict. And his strive to get to the crux of the matter, to understand this history, is precious. As I've said, the situation in Ukraine has to do with fundamental threats to our security. Moreover, we've always considered the Ukrainian nation, and I've said it multiple times, a brotherly nation, however strange it may sound in these conditions. We have the same roots, and everything that's happening is a tragedy for us and terrible wound. Therefore, the country is sincerely interested in putting an end to it. At the same time, we're convinced that in order to make the settlement lasting and long-term, we need to eliminate all the primary roots, the primary causes of that conflict. And we've said it multiple times, to consider all legitimate concerns of Russia and to reinstate a just balance of security in Europe and in the world on the whole. And I agree with President Trump, as he has said today, that naturally the security of Ukraine should be ensured as well. Naturally, we are prepared to work on that. I would like to hope that the agreement that we've reached together will help us bring closer that goal and will pave the path towards peace in Ukraine. We expect that Kiev and European capitals will perceive that constructively and that they won't throw a wrench in the works. They will not make any attempts to use some backroom dealings to conduct provocations to torpedo the nascent progress. Incidentally, when the new administration came to power, bilateral trade started to grow. It's still very symbolic. Still, we have a growth of 20%. As I've said, we have a lot of dimensions for joint work. It is clear that the U.S. and Russian investment and business cooperation has tremendous potential. Russia and the U.S. can offer each other so much in trade, digital, high-tech, and in space exploration. We see that Arctic cooperation is also very possible, and our international context, for example, between the Far East of Russia and the West Coast of the U.S. Overall, it's very important for our countries to turn the page, to go back to cooperation. It is symbolic that not far away from here, at the border between Russia and the U.S., there is a so-called international date line. I think you can step over, literally, from yesterday into tomorrow. And I hope we'll succeed in that, in political sphere. I would like to thank President Trump for our joint work, for the well-wishing and trustworthy tone of our conversation. It's important that both sides are result-oriented, and we see that the President of the U.S. has a very clear idea of what he would like to achieve. He sincerely cares about prosperity of his nation. Still, he understands that Russia has its own national interests. I expect that today's agreements will be the starting point, not only for the solution of the Ukrainian issue, but also will help us bring back business-like and pragmatic relations between Russia and the U.S. And in the end, I would like to add one more thing. I'd like to remind you that in 2022, during the last contact with the previous administration, I tried to convince my previous American colleague that the situation should not be brought to the point of no return when it would come to hostilities. And I said it quite directly back then that it's a big mistake. Today, when President Trump saying that if he was the president back then, there will be no war. And I'm quite sure that it would indeed be so. I can confirm that. I think that overall, me and President Trump have built a very good, business-like and trustworthy contact. And I have every reason to believe that moving down this path, we can come, and the sooner the better, to the end of the conflict in Ukraine. Thank you. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. President. That was very profound. And I will say that I believe we had a very productive meeting. There were many, many points that we agreed on, most of them, I would say, a couple of big ones that we haven't quite gotten there, but we've made some headway. So there's no deal until there's a deal. I will call up NATO in a little while. I will call up the various people that I think are appropriate, and I'll, of course, call up President Zelenskiy and tell him about today's meeting. It's ultimately up to them. They're going to have to agree with what Marco and Steve and some of the great people from the Trump administration who've come here, Scott and John Ratcliffe, thank you very much. But we have some of our really great leaders. They've been doing a phenomenal job. We also have some tremendous Russian business representatives here, and I think everybody wants to deal with us. We've become the hottest country anywhere in the world in a very short period of time, and we look forward to that. We look forward to dealing. We're going to try and get this over with. We really made some great progress today. I've always had a fantastic relationship with President Putin, with Vladimir. We had many tough meetings, good meetings. We were interfered with by the Russia hoax. That made it a little bit tougher to deal with, but he understood it. I think he's probably seen things like that during the course of his career. He's seen it all, but we had to put up with the Russia hoax. He knew it was a hoax, and I knew it was a hoax, but what was done was very criminal. But it made it harder for us to deal as a country in terms of the business and all of the things that we'd like to have dealt with. But we'll have a good chance when this is over. So just to put it very quickly, I'm going to start making a few phone calls and tell them what happened. But we had an extremely productive meeting, and many points were agreed to. There are just a very few that are left. Some are not that significant. One is probably the most significant, but we have a very good chance of getting there. We didn't get there, but we have a very good chance of getting there. I would like to thank President Putin and his entire team, whose faces, who I know in many cases, other than that, whose faces I get to see all the time in the newspapers. You're almost as famous as the boss, but especially this one right over here. But we had some good meetings over the years, right? Good, productive meetings over the years, and we hope to have that in the future. But let's do the most productive one right now. We're going to stop really 5, 6, 7,000, thousands of people a week from being killed, and President Putin wants to see that as much as I do. So, again, Mr. President, I'd like to thank you very much, and we'll speak to you very soon and probably see you again very soon. Thank you very much, Vladimir.
Next time in Moscow.
Oh, that's an interesting one. I don't know. I'll get a little heat on that one, but I could see it possibly happening. Thank you very much, Vladimir. And thank you all. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Pretty remarkable. Not a question allowed by reporters in the room. And as you can see on Bloomberg TV, there are a lot of them. This is the chaos left from President Trump and President Putin making very quick action at the podiums. Very difficult to tell what was accomplished in this meeting, both referring to progress, Vladimir Putin even referring to a deal. But we have no details on what that might include other than an intention to meet again. This is special extended coverage on Bloomberg TV and radio, the Trump-Putin summit in Alaska. I'm Joe Matthew in Washington, and we thank you for being with us here on Balance of Power as we seek analysis now from our political panel. Bloomberg Politics contributors Rick Davis and Jeannie Sheehan Zaino have been with us for the duration, and I would like to hear from both of you here about what we just heard. Jeannie, there were big questions about whether they would be on the same page. It seems they were, not only with their appreciation for one another. It was like two friends being reunited, but in their eagerness to project progress, which may not be backed up by details. What did we just hear?
What we just heard, I think, is pretty clear that President Trump is going to go home with nothing in his pocket except for potentially a second meeting. And that's obviously something, but it is far, far less than I think he wanted. He does want to be a peacemaker here. And I think what is clear is that for all of the niceties and the talk of a relationship, they didn't at least indicate to us any progress by way of approaching peace or a ceasefire vis-a-vis Ukraine. You even heard a little bit from Vladimir Putin, from President Putin, blaming Ukraine for the situation. Not surprising, but it hardly shows that they made progress there. So I think President Trump going home empty-handed, and to your point, it's also very telling that neither president took questions from the press after all of this. They stood, they spoke, and they left. And so I think the reason is they don't have much to say for the time they spent together from the perspective of seeing anything get achieved vis-a-vis the Ukraine-Russian conflict.
Yeah. Do you agree with Jeannie on this, Rick Davis? And in what world is it appropriate to have the president of Russia kick off a news conference at a U.S. military base on American soil?
Yeah, this was my read was clearly this was a Putin meeting. One, probably requested the chance to speak first, knowing that it would create this level of diminishment for Donald Trump. Two, that statement he read, Vladimir Putin, could have been written 6 months ago. He came prepared with a statement that was going to make light of the pre-existing relationship between the U.S. and Russia, forgetting decades of hatred and conflict between the two countries. And you would expect that out of a KGB officer, right? Paint a picture of a flowering relationship that has no downside. And I'm not surprised that there is a semblance of a deal, because Vladimir Putin came probably with a deal. And it's probably the same deal he's been talking about for 3 years, which is give me the eastern portion of Ukraine, a ban on ever having Ukraine join NATO, and a disarmament of the Ukraine military. And he talked about those things that were threats to Russia that had to be stopped in order to make peace. If that is indeed the case, and he's been consistent about that, the president will get an earful from his friends in NATO, the European Union, and certainly from President Zelenskiy when he makes those phone calls.
You do wonder how those calls are going to go here, Jeannie. What would possess Donald Trump to have Vladimir Putin actually begin this news conference as if we were in Moscow, not in Anchorage? And did he, in the end, protect Putin from taking questions from American journalists?
Yeah, I mean, the whole thing from start to finish has been very odd. From the rolling out of the red carpet for somebody who has been indicted on war crimes from the ICC, to inviting him to U.S. soil in the first place, particularly a military base, then to your point, letting him speak first. I think we did hear from Vladimir Putin the kind of flattery that he knows Donald Trump wants. When he was talking, for instance, we heard it a couple times, but one point that struck me was when he was saying, oh, Donald Trump is right. If he had been elected, if he had been in office in 2020, none of this would have ever happened. It's hard to believe that, but certainly that's what Donald Trump says all the time and what he wants to hear. And I think the only question for Donald Trump now is, what are you going to do? You made this arrangement for him to come. You're leaving with absolutely nothing. Are you now going to pursue the tariffs that you've talked about? What angle are you going to play now? Because the only one who's won out of this so far is Vladimir Putin. The Russians are thrilled. He has been welcomed back by the U.S. president onto the world stage, treated like a king as he came down the red carpet. And all of that for apparently nothing except maybe a promise of a meeting next time in Moscow, which even Donald Trump said he would probably get some heat for. So I think Donald Trump, to me, looked slightly aggrieved, and he has every right to be, I think, at this point. And I think the question now is, how are you going to respond to this? Because he's going to not want to look like he's been played by Vladimir Putin, but that seems to be what has happened here.
Certainly. Jeannie Shanzano and Rick Davis will stay with us as we add the voice of Bloomberg managing editor Kevin Whitelaw with me here in Washington. Kevin, this was remarkable, and we'd appreciate your insights on what European leaders might make of this. First, they see Vladimir Putin open the news conference. Then no questions are taken, a reference to a deal, no details, not even a date to meet again. Was this summit a failure?
I mean, look, it's going to take a while to understand what Putin meant when he said agreement, right? Yeah. And so, Trump is getting on the phone, and we expect that he's going to be briefing the Ukrainians and some Europeans on what exactly happened. So the real question we'll have to answer in the next hours was there anything of substance here? And he just wanted to be able to brief the allies first. Yes. Unclear whether that's the case or not.
We'll allow for that.
So we're going to have to be looking into that. But obviously, that's what everyone's been nervous about across Europe, and particularly in Ukraine, is what might Trump give away? What might he concede? And even if there wasn't a deal, he may have offered concessions that then become part of the sort of ground game for any negotiation. Yes. And I think that is exactly what everyone in the NATO allies, European Union allies are worried about. But Ukraine, which is already suffering shortages of military equipment because of the various freezes on aid, sure. Their finances are in critical condition in many ways. This is a moment where they have to really, really worry that the president of the United States is just giving up parts of their territory and signaling to Russia that they're going to be able to get something out of this aggression.
Yeah. Kevin, stay with us as we bring you now live to Anchorage. Bloomberg's Annmarie Hordern was in the room for that, I guess, not news conference because not a question was asked. We'll call it maybe a vague announcement from Presidents Putin and Trump. It's a pretty busy place right now, Annmarie. Tell us what the feeling was in the room when these two walked out without talking to you.
Well, definitely unconventional that we are in the United States. This was an invitation from President Trump to the United States to President Putin, his first time in the U.S. since a decade. And it was President Putin who started out the news conference. And we do know it's an individual who does have a propensity to go very long. He is the one that mentioned security guarantees for Ukraine and mentioned an agreement. So then when the president decided to follow up and give his remarks, you thought that potentially he was going to give more details of a deal that was in the working based off the hours they spent together today, the contours potentially, but that's not what we got. One of the first things Trump said was there's no deal until there's a deal. And he said he had to call his European counterparts, the head of NATO, and President Zelenskiy, and ultimately he said it's up to them. So this said to me, especially since they didn't take questions, that territory was discussed, because remember, we only had the foreign policy 3-by-3 meeting between both these delegations, not the expanded meeting when you had the Commerce Secretary here and the Treasury Secretary here. So this was strictly likely about territorial swaps as I read it, and what the Russians were willing to offer. Maybe President Trump knows that is not something Volodymyr Zelenskiy can swallow. The third rail, the red line in Ukraine, of course, is Zelenskiy pulling out of the region Donbass, which Putin wants all of, the region Luhansk and Donetsk, where you have Volodymyr Zelenskiy and the Ukrainian front keeping a holdover. Very interesting they didn't take questions. I'm not surprised that maybe Vladimir Putin didn't want to take questions, but President Trump loves briefing the press, and I imagine he's going to brief the press on his way back to Washington, and he's also set to sit down for another Fox News interview, so maybe we will get some more color. Right. But he did say one of the first things he's going to do is call his European counterparts.
So, Annmarie, just to be clear, that extended session, the working lunch, as it was framed in the guidance from the White House with the Treasury and Commerce secretaries, is not happening now? Is everybody going home?
It does feel that way. I spoke to Kirill Dmitriev, the head of the Russian Direct Investment Fund, who is really kind of has become this interlocutor between Moscow, Washington, maybe the most direct contact to Steve Witkoff. And I kept asking him at the end, what happened here? Is there a cessation of hostilities? What kind of agreement is Putin talking about? And he said, more progress, more progress, more progress, more to come. But we don't have any details on if there's going to be another meeting soon, if there's going to be this secondary meeting. The president continuously teased all week, saying the second meeting is going to be even more important than the first, because likely that would include President Zelenskiy alongside President Putin and President Trump. As of now, it seems that everyone is packing up and going home.
Wow. Bloomberg's Annmarie Hordern went all the way to Anchorage to bring this story to us without even a dialogue with these two presidents. Pretty interesting result here, Annmarie. Thank you so much. I want to bring Kevin Whitelaw back in, Bloomberg managing editor, with the idea of a second meeting, as Donald Trump said, being more productive than the first. Should we assume there will be a second meeting? What if European leaders don't like this phone call?
I mean, European leaders have to react carefully here, because they, need to keep Trump on board with support to Ukraine. They're relying on the U.S. military supplies, weaponry to be delivered. So they have to find a way to keep him on sides without allowing him to make concessions that they simply find unacceptable. So they're going to have to continue to play this game of praising him gently while offering him cautions and words. My guess is the fact that this was a three-way meeting, 3-on-3, rather than a one-on-one, probably gave them a little bit of comfort. But I can imagine when they saw the two of those leaders in the back of the president's limousine, there were probably a lot of very, very nervous emails flying.
I'd still like to know what was said in that car. There wasn't a translator with them, so presumably Vladimir Putin was speaking English. Kevin, Donald Trump brought up what he likes to call the Russia hoax. Russia, Russia, Russia. In his very brief remarks, to think that he went there today tells us what?
Well, I think it just tells us that's the frame through which he's seen everything.
Still,
right? So, I mean,
nothing's changed.
Well, this meeting was as much about him as it was about trying to solve anything, right? I mean, he's been pretty clear he's waiting for that Nobel Peace Prize to be handed to him.
Yes.
Obviously, most of what happens to him, he sees through a political lens. And so, the Russia hoax was a knowing nod to people in a way to sort of say, hey, you see that I'm not not sort of part of that. But, I think as everyone else is watching this, that feels like ancient history. What really feels like the stakes are now is Ukraine's future and what, after all, Trump is going to do to a country that has otherwise been entirely isolated by most of the Western world, has been cut off and has had its economy absolutely torn apart by this sanctions regime. And Trump seems to be offering them a way out of some of that, and it's just not clear what Russia is going to give up, if anything.
Yeah. Lastly, Kevin, if this working lunch with an economic dialogue, including Bessent and Lutnick, their counterparts, in fact, is not going to take place as it does appear now, does that suggest the U.S. or even both sides overreached to think that we were going to have an economic summit today as well?
My guess is both sides, particularly the U.S. side, didn't know what was going to happen today. And I think they wanted to be ready for a lot of things. It was interesting that obviously the Russians brought a delegation that included an economic team as well. It did seem like maybe they thought there was more to happen to go on. At the same time, this did last quite a long time. So that does mean that they probably got somewhere in the conversation. Now, whether that meant that they realized that they're nowhere close, or whether that meant that they see a path forward, I think it's going to take a little while to sort out. But that was the longest meeting they've had.
You're right.
And I think that's not insignificant.
Kevin Whitelaw, thank you so much. With me here in Washington. And Kevin's right. This is stretched beyond 2.5 hours, which in fact was their longest meeting. It may have seemed short because of expectations that this could go on for twice as long. It obviously did not. And we want to bring our panel back in. Bloomberg Politics contributors Rick Davis and Jeannie Shanzano. Jeannie, Vladimir Putin mentioned Joe Biden, or at least referred to him in his remarks before President Trump spoke, knowing that Vladimir Putin spoke first. He criticized the former president, saying he can confirm that if Donald Trump had been president, this war never would have happened. Does he actually believe that?
I don't think so. I think it is part of his quote unquote charm offensive towards Donald Trump. Vladimir Putin is smart. He's strategic. He knows exactly what President Trump wants to hear, and that is that kind of flattery. He's just reflecting back to Donald Trump, something Donald Trump says all the time. And, what was so stunning to me was, at least watching it from afar, is despite that flattery, Donald Trump seemed a bit mixed emotionally when you just watched him there. After all, he flew all the way there. He rolled out the red carpet. He invited somebody who was wanted on war crimes to U.S. soil, a military base. He rode in the beast with him, smiling, clapped when he came. And he is leaving after 3 hours, couple hours, with nothing to show for it except some flattery. So I felt like even Donald Trump, who usually is prone to that kind of flattery, may have been thinking, this is not why I came all the way here, because what we all expected, Vladimir Putin shows absolutely no signs of moving at all away from what he has long said about his intent to hold the land that he's taken and to keep with what he demanded from Biden, quite frankly, in Istanbul, and has not been able to get from the Europeans, Ukraine, or the U.S. And Donald Trump now is the latest person to hear these demands and not to bend to them, thankfully.
Mm-hmm. The Bloomberg News headline says it all. Here at almost 7:30 p.m. Eastern Time, Trump-Putin news conference ends with no details on agreement. Rick Davis, we heard Vladimir Putin speak English very briefly at the end of his remarks. He said next time in Moscow, suggesting that the next session might happen in the Russian capital. Could that take place?
Well, if there is a universal peace between Russia and Ukraine that preserves Ukraine's sovereignty and independence, sure, yeah, why not, right? I mean, but that's likely to happen never. The reality is we've just got to, realize that Vladimir Putin is a trained KGB agent who uses every element of, subterfuge to disable his opponent. And in this case, let's not be kidding ourselves. Donald Trump is his opponent. The real test is going to be tomorrow morning when we wake up. Have missiles flown from Russia to the Ukraine, killing more Ukrainian people, have drones flown over the capital of Kyiv, attacking innocent civilians, has the ground troops continued an offensive in threatening the eastern Ukraine. I mean, that's going to tell us where this deal stands. And if that happens, I think Donald Trump puts himself in a position to have to then start answering questions about what was agreed to, because it didn't seem to shape the battlefield.
So, Jeannie, will Donald Trump regret the red carpet and the limo ride?
I think he is going to. Donald Trump said on the campaign trail he'd resolve this in 24 hours, I think it was. He said it over 50 times. He deeply believed they had a connection. And he went all this way with this summit today, rolling out the red carpet, only to really, I think he probably feels inside, be made something of a fool of, because there was nothing coming out of it. And that's why most leaders of the U.S. and other countries don't go into these summits with nothing to show for them. I am stunned that they didn't even talk about things outside of Ukraine, at least giving the president something to say he got in the end. So Donald Trump, I think, has to feel very aggrieved. No matter how much flattery Vladimir Putin throws his way, nothing can make up for the fact that he did not get what he came for.
Jeannie Shanzano and Rick Davis with piercing analysis. Our political panel will be with us throughout our special coverage this evening. No deal until there's a deal, as Donald Trump says. Stay with us with more on Balance of Power, only on Bloomberg. Welcome back to our special coverage on Bloomberg TV and radio. Balance of Power, the Trump-Putin summit. I'm Joe Matthew in Washington. The President of the United States speaking on the world stage a short time ago alongside Vladimir Putin. After their 2.5-hour-long summit, the two leaders offering little details of their summit. President Trump saying this about how it went.
I believe we had a very productive meeting. There were many, many points that we agreed on. Most of them, I would say, a couple of big ones that we haven't quite gotten there, but we've made some headway. So there's no deal until there's a deal.
Back with us now, Bloomberg's Vonnie Quinn, who's part of our special coverage live from World Headquarters in New York, and her view on the markets. Vonnie, how's the Russian economy holding up under the weight of the war and sanctions?
Well, as we know, Joe, Russia's economy is flirting with a technical recession, but in fact, it's been growing quite substantially over the last 2 years. So if it only grows between 1% and 2% this year, that's not an absolute disaster for the Russian economy, right? And also, we know that it's being managed. So interest rates are at 18%. They were at 21% to combat higher inflation. The governor, Elvira Nabiullina, did that on purpose, bringing down those rates now. So the economy is one thing, but let's take a look at market reaction after this summit today. The only real asset class that you can watch for current trading is Bitcoin, right? The crypto markets trade constantly. We did see Bitcoin up about 0.4% for most of the day. And as Presidents Trump and Vladimir Putin came onto the podium and gave their remarks, you saw Bitcoin taking a turn. Directionally, it is giving us a signal. It's showing us that perhaps the dollar is now more attractive, and perhaps there is some disappointment out there. Perhaps this is a risk-off move. In the last while, Bitcoin has been a risk-on type of trade. Again, we're a little bit grasping at straws here, but we'll know a lot more on Sunday. 5 p.m. we'll see currency markets open in earnest with the euro trading. 6 p.m. oil markets will get going, and then also S&P and Dow futures, and we'll have a lot more information on how the market is taking this. Now, we know, for example, that market participants were not really expecting too much out of today's summit. In fact, they're not expecting too much for the year. JP Morgan saying the chances of a ceasefire almost insignificant. But you did have polymarkets betting rise quite substantially in the last week, and the hopes that there might be some kind of even partial ceasefire. I did want to point as well to a couple of different charts. So there's an interesting chart which shows Russian defense stocks and a basket of Ukrainian stocks that would do well in a ceasefire scenario. Now, they've both been rising and are still holding close to their highs of the last 2 years, which is fascinating. It shows you that both sentiments are out there in the market. Potentially, defense stocks will still be very, very much in demand by investors, but also those ceasefire stocks doing well could indicate that investors are thinking that, yes, maybe now there is a glimmer of hope for a ceasefire. We'll also be obviously carefully watching oil markets, because if we do get anything from phone calls that might take place later on this evening, if we get any more details, both presidents were obviously very stum about what what they spoke about. We did have President Trump saying that, the bigger points are still to be agreed upon, but there was some breakthroughs. He seemed to suggest we won't hear about that until after he's presumably spoken to NATO and Vladimir Zelenskiy. If there is anything, then maybe we'll see some kind of movement related to oil. You see the spike on the board when the war started. Oil markets just went crazy. Then everything settled down again. We've been having OPEC Plus come back into the market, take some production offline, slowly bring that production online. Essentially, oil has been dropping, so has natural gas. Will we see that continue to drop if there is any kind of glimmer of intention for Russian energy assets to come back online? Well, we might see some of that next week, or it might take a little bit longer. But essentially, that's another chart to watch as well, Joe.
Vonnie, thank you so much. Great reporting. Bloomberg's Vonnie Quinn helping us with the market side of all of this, and we'll check back with Vonnie a bit later on. Shortly after the summit between Trump and Putin concluded, both men spoke before the cameras. Briefly, Putin speaking first, offering his thanks to President Trump. Here's that moment.
I would like to thank President Trump for our joint work, for the well-wishing and trustworthy tone of our conversation. It's important that both sides are result-oriented, and we see that the President of the U.S. has a very clear idea of what he would like to achieve. He sincerely cares about prosperity of his nation. Still, he understands that Russia has its own national interests. I expect that today's agreements will be the starting point, not only for the solution of the Ukrainian issue, but also will help us bring back business-like and pragmatic relations between Russia and the U.S.
For more, we bring in Ben Jensen to the conversation, director of the Futures Lab, senior fellow for the Defense and Security Department at CSIS, the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Ben, really glad you're here. Thank you for joining us. The line from President Trump was, there's no deal until there's a deal. What does that mean for the situation on the ground in Ukraine? Will we see bombing in Kyiv tonight?
Well, besides being a tautology, yes. And you actually saw it during this talks. So I think you've seen Putin express a dual strategy. There's the fight along the front line, then there's the war of the cities, how he's bombing these cities, the firepower strikes. And so what's interesting is that he actually hit multiple cities hard last night, as President Zelenskiy kind of made a press conference about during these talks. And so now we should already about this time be seeing the actual activity in Kyiv. So one thing we could watch is there is a statistically significant difference in the attacks tonight. If it's lower, that might be a signal from the Kremlin to President Trump more than President Zelenskiy. But I would expect there to still be war as both sides take whatever private conversation they had back, talk about it with their partners, and try to figure out the next step of this negotiation.
Sure. So we could hear air raid sirens imminently in Kyiv. It sounds like. Do you worry after just this effusive reception, the red carpet, the limo ride, the handshaking, thank you, Vladimir, that providing weapons to Ukraine, for instance, even if NATO is paying for it, might actually be on the table?
I think the actual weapons deal will stay. I think a president prides himself in negotiation at multiple levels. So I think he is kind of determined with his cabinet. I think Vice President Vance is part of this as well, that it is acceptable for Europeans to buy American weapons to keep Ukraine in the fight. I think that's very established now. We're through that drama in the relationship. I think the bigger question lurking in front of us, and you saw this in some of your reporting on trying to use markets to anticipate political activity, which is why people love Bloomberg. Like, we can actually, markets are rational. People are not, right? Well, not always, but they're more rational than people. So we can watch that, and what are they telling us? They're telling us that people are making monetary bets that the probability of a ceasefire has gone up. If the hydrocarbons are coming down a bit, there's a probability of Russian gas and LNG hitting the market again. So I think the markets are actually maybe catching this right, that we're in the early stage of a poker game. You don't play your hand in the first round. You wait a little bit, maybe all the way to the Strait or the river in Texas Hold'em. But I think here we're going to see what happens next. We're going to see over the next week, what's President Trump's conversation with Zelenskiy, with the Ukrainian leaders? When Putin sits with his closest advisors, his kind of inner circle of fellow, KGB assassins turned pretend businessmen, what do they talk about as well? And they're going to be signaling each other back and forth. And sadly for the Ukrainian people, I do think part of that signaling will be violence committed against civilians.
KGB assassins turned businessmen. President Trump said a lot of things about expectations for this meeting. He, on one end, said it was a catch-up and a feel-me-out session. But he also told European leaders he wanted a ceasefire. That was his goal. And that if there was no deal, if the fighting didn't stop in Ukraine, that there would be severe consequences. Will that become his red line?
I was so happy to hear our president say that today.
Well, it doesn't feel like it tonight, does it?
I think it's too soon to say.
Looks like they're going out to smoke cigars.
Yeah, they might be. But just because you smoke a cigar with the guy doesn't mean you can't rip him off in the deal the next day.
Is that what's about to happen?
I hope. This is a hope and a rational bet, but it's a low probability bet. When I heard the president signal earlier today that he was willing to actually, without a ceasefire, pursue secondary sanctions, that was a very promising sign to me. And our president takes this rhetoric seriously. So there's an old concept in political science called domestic audience costs. Once you say a commitment like that to your public, you're actually accountable, especially in a democracy. And so now the question is will the president actually back up that threat? And that's what we're going to watch. I think people were a little too eager to think things happen quickly. I would give that a few days. But my guess is there's back channels that happen over the next few days. And if there isn't a ceasefire or a reduction in hostilities, this puts a lot of pressure on President Trump to actually enact the secondary sanctions, which would be crippling to Putin and his ruling regime.
We have to remember, it was only a week or so ago that the president suggested that there were the deployment of a couple of nuclear submarines based on the rhetoric from Dmitry Medvedev, of all people. Is all this water under the bridge?
I don't think it's water under the bridge. I mean, we've always known we've had a contentious relationship with Russia. And frankly, that precedes even the Cold War.
And it includes a lot of bluster on both sides, doesn't it?
It does. If there's anything Russians and Americans have in common, is that we both like to talk a big game. But I do think the nuclear signaling, the military posturing, the good news for us is that we have a built-up muscle memory. The U.S. European Command and NATO know how to interpret Russian military moves. The Russian military knows how to interpret our moves. So we can have this weird rational signaling game with military forces. So I'm not worried about the nuclear posturing. What would concern me to watch going forward is that our president doesn't stick to the ceasefire threat. And Putin, I would expect to ratchet up the heat then. Absent any firm American line in these negotiations, I mean, Putin is a straight-up gangster. He will ratchet up the pressure. So you would see more attacks on cities. You may even see the introduction of another game-changing weapon, a new missile system. You would possibly even see more gray zone activity in Europe. Remember, this is a Kremlin that has authorized attacks against European business officials. So I think everything is on the table if America doesn't hold the line really in the next 96 hours.
Well, that's terrifying. We know both sides have suffered severe losses. That includes Russia. But Ukraine is, of course, much smaller and has a massive manpower problem, even if we keep sending material and equipment over there. How long can Ukraine continue to fight, realistically?
So this is the fascinating question. And I think it takes us back to an old economics concept called capital labor substitution. So we've known this in the business sector and economics for a long time, that actually you can use capital to substitute for labor by building out factories, more efficient processes. In our modern economy, it comes with software, it comes with training AI agents, maybe to even get rid of professors. But I think there's capital substitution in war going on as well. That's why you see these first-person view or FPV drones. That's why you see ground combat vehicles. And Ukraine has mastered the art of using automation to substitute for its lack of young males that it wants to send to fight. So you can't really count them out. Their ability to innovate and adapt on the battlefield has been nothing short of revolutionary to modern war.
At some point, they'll get rid of the anchors, too, Professor. Benjamin Jensen, I'm really glad you could join us this evening, Ben. Senior Fellow for the Defense and Security Department at CSIS. Thank you for being with us. Coming up, we'll bring you more coverage of the historic summit with a live report from the ground in Anchorage. It's next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. This is special extended coverage on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio, the Trump-Putin summit. I'm Joe Matthew in Washington as we continue coverage this evening with a live image on Bloomberg TV and on YouTube here of the planes of both world leaders sitting on the tarmac waiting to take them home, departing Anchorage after a roughly 2.5-hour summit. Here was President Trump commenting on the summit, the likelihood of a ceasefire deal a short time ago.
We had an extremely productive meeting, and many points were agreed to. There are just a very few that are left. Some are not that significant. One is probably the most significant, but we have a very good chance of getting there. We didn't get there, but we have a very good chance of getting there.
Let's stay in Anchorage right now with Bloomberg's Annmarie Hordern, who's reporting live from the very room that Putin and Trump just appeared in. Annmarie?
Good evening, Joe. Well, a lot of people were caught off guard because, of course, this was supposed to be a press conference, but what we had in the end was just two leaders giving statements. President Putin's honestly was prepared remarks, and he did, though, signal that an agreement had taken place, that they agreed to something. President Trump immediately said there is no deal until there's a deal. Basically, nothing is agreed until everything is agreed. And then he put a lot of weight on the phone conversations he's going to have subsequently leaving Anchorage, and that is going to be with European leaders, leaders of NATO, and, of course, with President Vladimir Zelenskiy. I think it is way too soon to jump to conclusions that we know really what the end game here was, because we just don't have enough details. Clearly, there was no full agreement. There's no cessation of hostilities, and we didn't even get past the 3-by-3 bilateral meeting with the foreign policy aides of both these leaders to expand into other discussions, which would have been a loss for Putin because, of course, he viewed this meeting in terms of restarting bilateral relationship with Washington to discuss New START, which, of course, expires in February of next year, to also discuss economic cooperation, rare earths in the Arctic. We're just south of the Arctic Circle, where we are now, and pressing for his economy are those sanctions. So we cannot jump to conclusions right now, but clearly this is the start of a much longer process. In the meantime, President Putin, though, was given, the red carpet as he landed in the United States for the first time, Joe, in a decade.
Quite literally, the red carpet was rolled out. Annmarie, the scene behind you is captivating. There was a news conference with two world leaders behind Annmarie just a short time ago. They are literally tearing down this operation, unplugging equipment and cameras, taking away chairs, as these two presidents prepare to leave Alaska and go home. Bloomberg's Annmarie Hordern, thank you for your great reporting this evening on Bloomberg. Now, for a look at the way Asia is watching this summit unfold, Bloomberg's Isabella Steger joins us live from Tokyo now. Isabella, thank you for being here. How are Asian markets viewing this summit today?
So Asia's just waking up to this, actually. And in Japan, a strong ally of the US, and they'll all also be waiting for Trump to brief them on what exactly has happened. One thing I wanted to highlight, actually, is the relationship with India, and they're probably still asleep, so they'll be coming on in a couple hours, I think. But that's really the big potential realignment that I think people should be watching. While all this is going on in Anchorage, there's a lot going on over here between India, Russia, and China. And India, of course, famously hit with the 50% tariff, extremely high, higher than many of its regional peers. Why? It's punished by Trump for importing Russian oil. So that's a really big piece of the puzzle that the US is going to need to figure out. Obviously, it sees India as a strong counterweight to China. But India and China are making up again now after a very, very bad relationship stemming from deadly border clashes. We've got visits from India to China. Indian delegation is going to be visiting Russia next week. So it's going to be really important to see how the US tries to weigh its relation with India while also pursuing this relationship with Russia.
Bloomberg's Isabella Steger, we thank you so much for the insights, Isabella. And we're getting Democratic response now to what just happened in Anchorage. Among the first to weigh in, Congressman Gregory Meeks of New York. He's the ranking member on the House Foreign Affairs Committee, out with a statement that says, quote, the fact that this meeting even took place at the invitation of President Trump on American soil, without Ukraine present and with zero concessions from Russia, is an undeserved reward for Putin. By quite literally rolling out the red carpet, Trump, he writes, has legitimized Russia's aggression and whitewashed Putin's war crimes. It's shameful, unquote. Back with us now, our political panel this evening, Bloomberg Politics contributors Rick Davis, partner at Stone Court Capital, our Republican strategist, alongside Democratic analyst Jeannie Shanzano, senior democracy fellow with the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress. What should be our takeaway here, Rick, in our final moments? We've spent many hours today leading up to this very important meeting, we were told historic summit, only to see an anticlimactic news conference and still no details of a deal. Will there be another meeting?
It's hard to tell right now. You're right. I mean, the build up to this, the sudden nature of it, the high expectations that were sort of originally dripped out of the White House, then Trump tamping them down, then raising them up again on the flight to Alaska, has been a roller coaster for public diplomacy. But it seems to this hour, the only real winner is Vladimir Putin, who got to come to the United States in a historic moment, stand side by side, be treated as a world leader on par with the President of the United States, lifting him out of obscurity within Russia, as a war criminal. It's really going to be something if nothing comes of this.
Boy, your take on that, Jeannie. Must there be a second meeting to justify the first? We have to remind ourselves, Donald Trump did not need to do this. European leaders wanted to be at the table today. So did Vladimir Zelenskiy.
Yeah, I mean, and let's think about why he did it, because he blew through that deadline of imposing secondary sanctions and secondary tariffs. And you were just talking about China waking up, Asia waking up, and what the relationship with the United States is going to be like with India going forward, because the president promised severe consequences if there wasn't an agreement today and wasn't a ceasefire. So now the ball is in his lap. Is he going to impose those? I don't suspect he's any more inclined to do that than he was last Friday. But now he's got this real sort of what he's going to perceive as an embarrassment on his hands that he left there with nothing. And the likes of people like Democrats and Gregory Meeks, that's not going to bother him so much. It's going to be the Republicans and his base and the 61% of Americans who say something's got to be done about Russia that he is going to be concerned about. So this leaves him in a difficult position. Hard to impose those secondary sanctions, those secondary tariffs. Yeah. And what does he have left? He's got the $350 billion. So he needs a second meeting. He needs a deal, but Russia is not inclined to do it. Vladimir Putin wants to talk about the causes of this war. That's all he wanted to talk about, and he blames Ukraine for that.
We just watched Vladimir Putin bound up the stairs to his aircraft to make his way home. Rick Davis, Donald Trump will soon do the same, and these two leaders will be wheels up. A striking moment to watch Vladimir Putin deliver the first words in the news conference today. He opened the event as Donald Trump showed a hand, welcoming him to do so. Was that the right move?
No, Donald Trump should have owned the stage. He should have dictated the terms of this entire meeting. He should have framed the outcome of this based on U.S. Western norms. What is the expectations in the future? And then, and only then, could he then have Vladimir Putin go through his rehearsed statement to obscure the challenged relationship between U.S. and Russia, both historically but also presently. I mean, it was the greatest gift of Vladimir Putin. And maybe this is the Donald Trump butter him up before you take him down. But I fear that lunch was canceled, but everyone was eating tacos today.
Wow. I read you. Jeannie, the president told reporters on Air Force One when he went to the back of the plane, I want to see a ceasefire rapidly. I don't know if it's going to be today, but I'm not going to be happy if it's not today. So he leaves Alaska unhappy?
He does. And, you know, I give the president credit. He took a gamble going. It's not one I would have taken or advised, but he took it. And I think the question now is, what does he do going forward? Has he really learned who Vladimir Putin is? And the fact is that he's not willing to negotiate with Donald Trump the way Donald Trump has long promised. And what does he do about that, I think, is the question going forward. But it is clear the president has long said he wants peace. He wants a ceasefire. Europe, NATO, certainly the Ukrainians are behind him. But how do they get there is a question, because Russia has the population behind them. And what cards does the president in the West have to play? He's going to have to work with our allies to do that. And he hasn't been clear about what those sanctions will be at this point.
We just talked to Ben Jensen at CSIS, Rick, who's going to be watching the skies over Kyiv this evening. If the air raid sirens are going off and missiles are slamming into civilian neighborhoods, was today a failure?
Well, I think he mentioned, and aptly so, that while Donald Trump was in the air, missiles were flying across the Russian territory to kill innocent civilians inside of Ukraine. So if that was prep to a ceasefire, I'm not exactly sure I get the point. It is highly unlikely that we wake up tomorrow morning and there's still not a conflict going on the border of Ukraine. And if that's the case, the clock will be ticking on Donald Trump to announce some form of sanctions.
Rick Davis and Jeannie Shanzano, many thanks to you both for your great analysis and insights. We witnessed a lot together this evening, and thank you for spending time with us as well on this special extended edition of Balance of Power. In Washington, I'm Joe Matthew. This is Bloomberg.